Hello, this is a guy who likes fanfiction and is too lazy to read, so here is Introverted in audio form. Check the description for the links to the author. Chapter 1, Introversion. His back leaned against the wall of his one-room apartment. The light sound of the water droplets falling from the faucet reached his ears that twitched slightly at the noise. He blearily opened his eyes, turning them to the calendar on the other side of the wall. From the window nearby, the sun dawning tinged the clear blue sky a nice rosy tint. The date was important. He had circled it with a bright red color for a reason. Today was the day of the Genin exams. He stood up, wincing as the sprained ankle of the night before hurt him still. Now it was just sprained, while earlier it had been broken. It had been an accident. Of course, the construction crew hadn't seen him walking beneath them. He didn't know whether to feel elated they actually hadn't, or saddened that they might have lied. He had been doing his best to remain as quiet and invisible as possible, so maybe it had been his own fault. On the other hand, the workers should have been watching out for people below. He had learned that bright colors were a no-no, but so too were the dark ones. In a village of shinobis, going around paraded in an all-black suit was idiotic. Soft colors worked best to not stand out. A soft beige color jacket, a light green shirt, and a pair of brown shorts. The only thing dark was his sandals' color, but nobody ever looked at another's feet while walking or talking, so he was safe. To be seen was to be pointed at, whispered from behind, to be ignored when you had a question to ask. So he instead decided to be the one to ignore the others. He wasn't the smartest tool of the shed, but he knew when he wasn't wanted, and he had done just that. He had hidden himself away. Instead of screaming to the wind for the people to recognize him, he had hidden so that the people could forget about him. The number of murmurs and whispers had exponentially decreased after that. Just like the calls for demon or similar. No longer pranking, no longer yelling, and soon he was left alone. He should have known, he was just worsening his own situation by acting like a fool, but thankfully it was now fixed. He didn't eat breakfast, his fridge was half empty and his stomach queasy to begin with. Quietly, he made his way through the back alleys and the dark streets that riddled the city of Konoha, moving towards the academy. It was quite a longer route than merely running through the main street, but it also kept him away from the crowd and the glares. He hated the glares. He didn't know when he had realized that people didn't look at him with a kind gaze, but once he had realized a terrible truth: everyone, except maybe the old man, always glared when looking at him. The shinobi at least held a sort of indifferent mask on their features, but the civilians hated him. He would have given the world for a reason, at least he could have changed his ways earlier. He finally reached the Shinobi Academy after a few minutes, the building standing silently as the early morning hour made it deserted. He walked through the still empty corridors, his face softening as he remembered the times spent outside of the classroom, times he no longer had to serve after stopping with his pranks. It was nice and cool within the stone building, even with the warmth of the summer sun. A light breeze stretched from the open windows. He could hear the soft murmurs of the staff a few rooms above, and the chirping of the birds amongst the trees. He entered the classroom and reached for his desk, in the last row but far from the window. He sat down, and bringing both of his arms crossed in front of him, he lowered his head and waited for the bell to ring. Soon he heard the clattering of feet, and the door swung open gently but firmly once more. Suzuki Uchiha walked in, stilling as he stared at him with his own eyes. The raven-haired boy, wearing his usual blue jacket with the Uchiha fan, analyzed him for a second, before nodding. Naruto nodded back, before watching the Uchiha take his own seat halfway in the classroom, near the window. The relationship between them was strange, to say the least. There was a sort of begrudging respect, only neither of the two actually held a grudge against the other. They just were both people who didn't like to talk to others. One because he probably would just be yelled at to keep quiet, the other because people would fawn over him in an instant. The door opened once more, as Hinata Hyuga entered third. The girl looked with her pale white eyes at both of them, before shyly and silently making her way to the last row near the window. She began to twiddle her fingers, moving back and forth her indexes as she gave hesitant glances towards him. He didn't bother to ask why. He didn't know when the girl had started looking at him, but he couldn't bring himself to talk to her. He could ruin everything he had become, it wouldn't do to once more be subjected to the glares of the people of Konoha, not now that he had finally learned how to avoid most of them. The noises now grew in intensity. People began to flock in, the chatter in the room increasing until it became unbearable for him. Shikamaru Nara plopped down next to him, with Chuji following and munching on chips. The boisterous Kiba sat next to Shino and Hinata, while the pink-haired Sakura was trying to woo Sasuke with Ino fighting her every step of the way. Troublesome. Shikamaru mumbled, his dark eyes flicking from him to the sensei's desk. Munch, munch, why? Chuji asked, a packet of chips opened in his hands. The slightly overweight boy was some sort of sidekick of the Nara, and Naruto felt slightly envious that the boring and lazy boy actually had such a friend. He didn't have one, so of course he had to feel envy for someone who, in doing nothing, actually got a friend. They'll split us in teams, Shikamaru remarked. The Inoshikacho formation is one team, for example. The Nara explained to the surprised Akimichi, who merely nodded thoughtfully. Then there's the dead last placed in the team of the Rookie of the Year and the second best of the class. The shadow user continued, and if we take that into account, then it's obvious we'll end up with Ino. Chuji frowned slightly. Can't we have Hinata? That wouldn't work, Shikamaru pointed out. If Hinata was with us, in place of Ino, we would have no long-range tactics. You still need to deploy melee after all. The spiky-haired Nara sighed, troublesome. Naruto listened in silence. He had been the dead last of the academy for a while, but since that event he no longer held the place. He didn't know if the nominee to dead last worked on the average of all years or only of the last year. If it did base itself on the cumulative ratings for all years, even if he suddenly became Rookie of the Year in terms of placements, he would still be the last. As it was, he was comfortably standing in the slightly lower than average result. He had crammed up for the exam, expecting something written or a display of taijutsu or shuriken jutsu, but as the time passed nervousness began to take its toll of him, since the sensei had yet to arrive. He was already profusely sweating by the time one of the teachers entered the classroom. Silence! Iruka-sensei exclaimed. The man had a scar on his face, and his dark brown hair was held in a short ponytail on the back. He wore the Chiryunin flak jacket, and was holding with his hands a scroll, probably containing the names of the students. Come when called in room 1A, and we will administer the test. As the name call proceeded, he began to tremble. What if he wasn't good enough to pass? He had trained hard for this, he wanted to pass. No, he needed to pass. His dingy apartment was starting to break apart, and unless he actually earned the money to repair it, he would end up evicted while the owner of the complex made the repairs. Considering his luck, he would end up homeless for weeks. Uzumaki, Naruto. His name called, he stood up fast, hitting his sides with the corner of the table and wincing in pain. He held the tears in his eyes as he quickly walked downwards, and from there to room 1A. Iruka merely nodded at him stiffly, ticking his name off the scroll. He walked through the hallway to the adjacent room, where only Mizuki-sensei stood in wait, sitting with his back against the wall of the empty classroom. On a desk nearby, the various headbands with the symbol of the leaf glinted because of the light of the sun that peered through the window. Oh, Naruto-kun, the man began with a light smile. Third time's the charm, they say. Yeah. He replied. His voice was raucous as the word came out. How many days had it been since he had last talked to someone? He didn't remember. Well, can you do a henge of the Hokage? Mizuki asked kindly. He nodded and smiled. His fingers went into the correct position, and concentrating on the chakra within his lower stomach, he pulled at it. There was a small puff of smoke, and the next instant Naruto Uzumaki was gone, replaced by Hiruzen Sarutobi, the third Hokage. Good. The teacher praised him. Now can you do a bunshin? He froze slightly, gulping down nervously before releasing the henge. He could do this. He had practiced. He had repeatedly tried with increasing frustration until the point of exhaustion, and he could do this. He knew he could. He slowly began to pull at his chakra again. Far more slowly than how he did for the henge. He imagined himself tearing a small, really small piece of parchment from an enormous scroll that was his chakra pool. There was no puff of smoke, but two sickly and pale Naruto bunshins appeared near him, both face down on the ground and both seemingly dead. Mizuki's face was ecstatic. The Chiryunin-sensei walked towards the headbands and handed one over to him, smiling brightly. "Congratulations, Naruto. You did it." He smiled back with hesitation, before grasping the headband and tightly knotting it around his forehead. He was a shinobi now. He was a protector of Konoha. He felt his heart bursting from his chest, his desire to scream reached the base of his throat, and then he held it there. He wasn't going to scream. He wasn't going to yell how happy he was for this. He just couldn't. As a shinobi of the leaf, you are hereby declared legally an adult. Mizuki began, signing a scroll on the desk. You also have access to the library of Konoha, but only to the genin-related sections. You are also eligible to receive standard shinobi equipment from the ninja office, as well as having an account open in the Konoha Shinobi Bank from this moment henceforth. The man scribbled something on a piece of paper. As an orphan, you have no guardian and thus it falls entirely to you to open up an account or simply receive checks for mission payment. Mizuki finished speaking, handing over to him a small scroll. This is a storage scroll. It contains your ninja number, the information needed to activate your bank account and the shinobi rules. You are to memorize everything. Naruto nodded back, displaying for once a cranked-up smile. He then turned around and left quietly. Maybe he'd go to Ichiraku to celebrate. It would be sort of a splurge of his meager finances, but it would be good to eat something warm for once. He left through the main door of the school and stilled for a moment. That was a big no-no. He had forgotten, the parents would be there to congratulate their own children. He tensed and then awkwardly began to walk stiffly towards the exit. He didn't look at the other children. He didn't look at his ex-classmates. He didn't look at their parents. He just walked quietly, and slowly managed to leave without attracting attention. There had been no whispers or murmurs towards him. No heated glares or pointed fingers. Maybe he was safe now that he was a shinobi? That boy passed. A voice reached his ears, and suddenly he knew he had been wrong. Really, what are they thinking, passing a demon like him? Another voice added. They should have failed him. He dashed for the dirty alleyways the next second, running with his heart pumping in his chest until he reached his apartment. He was a shinobi now, he shouldn't be afraid of the murmurs and the glares, but he just couldn't stand them. He had wanted to scream at the voices to shut up and leave, but he merely hadn't been able to. He wasn't a coward. He was sure he could fight them off if he wanted to, but why should he? Yelling out loud just got people killed, it didn't save them. Why couldn't they look at someone else? What did he have that made him different? What was the reason they all called him a demon? The idea of going to Ichiraku was discarded with his dropping mood. The moment he slipped inside his house, he closed the door behind him and then silently started to clean. There was little else he could do. He had a deck of cards, but after months of solitaire it became an absolute hell to even look at it. He just hoped his teammates would be decent people. He just hoped they would be his first friends. It took him a while to get used to it, but eventually he had found things to do when alone. Instead of screaming and running around the village, he would silently make rounds on the roof of the building. Instead of playing with other children, he would look at the running shinobi that dashed on the rooftops, trying to catch them with his eyes as they moved. A few of them actually waved at him as they went, somehow without even turning their gaze to look at him or slowing down. The rooftop of the apartment complex was the place where he had the most social encounters to begin with. He decided there and then, while pondering on what to do to pass the time, he'd do a bit of light training, and then the next morning, as early as humanly possible, he would go and do everything Mizuki-sensei had told him to do. In that way he wouldn't be seen by many people. Unknown to the young Naruto, Uzumaki recently made genin of Konohagakure no Sato Hiruzen Sarutobi was silently watching him through the crystal glass in his office. The old third Hokage was biting nervously on his pipe, puffing out small clouds of smoke as he saw the dejected face of Naruto turn to one with a light smile. He couldn't help but cringe, as he felt his heart constrict a little. Once the blonde boy had been vivacious, like a boisterous grandchild. Something had happened one day, something the boy had never told him, and the next day he had been different. He had been subdued, silent, and melancholic to say the least. He now rarely smiled. He rarely yelled or talked to someone else. He had used the crystal ball to actually see how he would fare in his exam, even though once he was sure Naruto would have been the first to run up to him and show his forehead protector with pride. He sighed. He wouldn't have let Naruto pass, and had Iruka been there, the Chiryunin-sensei wouldn't have either. Mizuki had probably acted out of his good heart for a fellow orphan, and he couldn't actually fault such an act. If Naruto was unprepared, he would simply be failed by his Jounin instructor, and that would be that. He looked at the paperwork on his desk, neatly piled up. He could use a Kage Bunshin and be done with it, but something required his personal touch beforehand. He needed to decide the teams. He couldn't, in good conscience, place Naruto together with Sasuke, who had passed with top marks. The boy would make his teammates fail, and he shuddered at what Homura, Koharu, and Danzo would say if the last of the Uchiha ended up having to repeat the year. Unfortunately, placing Naruto in that team would mean passing him by force. He couldn't bring himself to send Naruto outside without a workable Bunshin. He couldn't even put the boy in the same team as a clan children, it would simply make the selected clans angry. His only choice was to split up the teams in a different way. Naruto could go with Sakura Haruno, a civilian who had no backing whatsoever, and with the pitiful marks she held on the physical evaluations, a possible fail candidate. He needed a third shinobi, however. Someone who nobody would make a ruckus for if he failed. He was thinking about it, and was already starting to believe that maybe he could put another female. There was a certain Ami in the list when the door of his office opened to admit Danzo. The old teammate of his walked in slowly, half of his body covered in bandages and holding up with sheer willpower and a wooden walking stick. Hiruzen, the war hawk, greeted him with his name. I have heard interesting news. Oh? Pray tell. Hiruzen took another puff of tobacco, before slowly standing up from behind his desk and making his way to the window. He wouldn't admit it, but being in the same room with Danzo always made him think that one day, the man would come in with a kunao in hand, scream banzai and attack him. He slightly chuckled at the mental image, but cleared his features the moment Danzo walked to stand next to him. The Jinhiriki has passed his examination. The cane tapped lightly on the ground, pitiful display, nearly dead last, and not worthy of being called a weapon for Konoha. I know. Hiruzen replied with a dull tone. The third Hokage shook his head slightly. He did better than the last time, but I could train him. Danzo remarked. I could make him better. A better weapon, perhaps, but a better man. Danzo's face morphed into a scowl. He is a Jinhiriki, a human sacrifice, his place is as a weapon. You forget, Danzo, our teacher's words. Hiruzen lightly replied, still shaking his head. And as long as you'll forget them, I'm afraid I won't be inclined in handing Naruto over to your personal training facility. The Yami of Shinobi merely stilled for a second, before releasing a breath he didn't believe he had held. You need a third shinobi, do you not? Now that you know that I know of any, you offer one of your own. Hiruzen raised an eyebrow. I asked you to disband that group, Danzo. It is inhuman. Inhuman, but not ineffective. He retorted calmly. How about a deal, Hiruzen? I too have a sort of defective product. The third Hokage frowned, but said nothing, waiting for Danzo to explain himself. You are building a team that is meant to fail, I know, because I would do the same in your position. Not out of kind-heartedness, however. Hiruzen snorted. He knew the man would rather avoid Konoha's weapon from dying outside, rather than actually care for the boy. Does it matter the mean to the end? Danzo lightly rebuffed him, before continuing. I will place my defective shinobi with yours. Then we will see the results of your academy training compared to my root training, and we will do so by taking into account the lowest possible grades available. And if they pass because of your shinobi, then it means the Jinhiriki will at least be protected by a slightly better than average genin. Danzo didn't miss a beat as he answered back. The third Hokage remained thoughtful, but said nothing for a while. The silence stretched to the point where Danzo was just about starting to lose his patience, his index finger twitching lightly as it tapped against the cane. Why not? Hiruzen nodded to himself. But if something happens to Naruto because of your operative, Danzo, you don't want to see me angry. The third Hokage smiled then, and Danzo grinned back. Of course, Hokage-sama. As Danzo left, Hiruzen returned to his desk. The team for Naruto was ready now. Naruto Uzumaki, Sakura Harano, and the failed operative of Danzo would work together. Now he needed a sensei and a replacement. The other civilian girl, Ami, would go with the Uchiha. Since another male was needed, he grabbed Kiba and Yazuka to place in the roster. The Inoshikacho formation was complete, but now the problem was with Shino Abarame and Hinata Hyuga. He needed yet one more shinobi to complete their ranks. His eyes fell down on the students who had shinobi as parents. A certain Hibachi appeared to have a father in the Konoha's ninja department. It was enough. He knew he was probably condemning to early death students who would not have normally passed the exams, but he had to prevent Naruto both from being heartbroken once more, as he certainly would if he were to go and annul his forehead protector, and from dying if he actually went out of the village with the skills he had. No, he was not sorry, he was doing what was best for everyone's interests, except maybe Ami's and Hibachi's. With a tired sigh, the old man closed his eyes and began to snore lightly, folding his arms over his chest in the particular signature jutsu of the Kage Bunshin. As his clone began to work, muttering under his breath about damnable old coots, the original one chuckled. The day of the team selection, Irika Umino glanced at the roster with a perplexed expression. His eyes traveled to the students, all nervously awaiting their teammates' names. Team 7 will be composed by Sasuke Uchiha, Ami Sato, and Kiba and Yazuka. Your sensei will be Kakashi Hatake. He saw the civilian girl in the back row's fist pump in the air, before sneering at the other girls who had lost. The two girls closest to Sasuke, Harano, and Yamanaka, both looked defeated with their faces downwards. The Yazuka merely snorted and strongly whined about being in the same team as Sasuke. Team 8 will be composed by Shino Abarame, Hinata Hyuga, and Hibachi Seto. Your sensei will be Kurane Uehai. The Abarame and the Hyuga both looked at one another, gently bowing in a sign of respect. The civilian boy on the other hand seemed affronted, but because of what Irika had no idea. Team 9 is still in effect from last year. Team 10 will be Shikamaru Nara, Ino Yamanaka, and Chuji Akimichi. Your sensei will be Asuma Sarutobi. He proceeded to list the remaining teams, until he finally reached the last one. Team 13 will be Naruto Uzumaki, Sakura Harano, and Sai Sato. Your sensei will be Aoba Yamashiro. All students, please wait in the classroom for your Jounin sensei to collect you. Irika then stiffly made his way out from behind the desk and headed for the door. He stopped midway however, and turned to address the classroom one last time. From this moment hence, you are all shinobi of the leaf. You will live, bleed, and die for your village. You are no longer children, but adults. Remember this. Then Irika walked outside, leaving behind puzzled and perplexed children. The teachers began to stroll in, and as they did Naruto turned his gaze towards the pink-haired girl. Sakura had been one of his early crushes and one of his early friends, but she too had begun to glare and stare at him eventually, just like the other children, and then she had begun making fun of him. He had been left alone once more, and the girl had moved to become friends with Ino first, and then a rival to her for Sasuke's affection. He had been forgotten afterwards. He turned his gaze around the classroom, trying to connect the name Sai to a face. He didn't remember anyone called Sai in the class, but then again he hadn't bothered to memorize the names of all the students. The girl had apparently decided to stand, turning her gaze around until she met his eyes. She gave him a tentative wave, and he perplexedly gave a nod back. Seemingly happy with that, the girl began bickering with Ami who apparently wanted the spot near Sasuke-kun. The boisterous Kiba was instead loudly whining of his teammates, walking downwards and jumping on the desk of the last of the Uchiha. The funny thing was that Sasuke was sort of glancing towards him, with a look that betrayed the love he had for the team he ended up in. He merely gave him an awry grin and a shrug of the shoulders, and the Uchiha nodded back gruffly. "Hello Dickless." Naruto blinked. He turned his gaze to the side, where a pale-skinned and raven-haired boy stood with a plastered smile. The boy was holding a tanto on the back, and seemed to be holding far better shinobi equipment than him, but what truly puzzled Naruto was the fact that the boy was holding an ink brush and an empty scroll in front of him. "Hello," he replied. The dark-haired boy said nothing more, albeit he did keep on his plastered smile. Naruto frowned, but remained silent too. A few seconds later, Sakura joined them. "Hello. I'm Sakura." She smiled. "I never saw you in class before," she added, turning her emerald gaze to Sai. "I was privately trained, ugly." Sai replied calmly, smiling as Sakura's fist collided with his face and sent him reeling against the wall. "How rude. Shan Naro," she screamed, huffing as she locked her eyes in fury with the raven-haired boy. Naruto instead merely stood up and moved slowly backwards, wanting to avoid taking part in his teammates' ordeals. It wasn't actually his business. Sure, they were teammates, and he had hoped to make friends out of them, but he knew he shouldn't have been so hopeful. As long as one had hope, it could be crushed. One called him dickless and the other was an enraged fangirl who had broken his childhood trust. He doubted they would or even could work together as a team, no matter what. His eyes trailed downwards, looking as the Jounin senseis came to get their students. 5 minutes had passed since he was standing against the wall, when Sasuke joined him with a staggered and bewildered expression. Naruto could see both Kiba and Ami animatedly talking to one another, with endearing terms like bitch and uncouth mongrel flying. "Uzumaki," Sasuke began, somehow curt and yet showing an undertone of something else Naruto couldn't place. He would have called it despair for an intelligent conversation, had said undertone a name. He raised an eyebrow at being called, but answered back. "Uchiha. I. Team 13. A Jounin spoke loudly from the doorway, and Naruto tensed as he looked to the sunglass-wearing man and then back to Sasuke. "See you later," Naruto hazarded, and was somehow surprised when Sasuke actually nodded to him. Shocked, he kept on walking down the stairs of the classroom, reaching for his teacher as Sakura and Sai soon joined him. Their sensei seemed young, with dark, spiky hair. He had red-framed sunglasses on his face, which obscured his eyes. He wore the standard Konoha shinobi outfit complete with flak jacket and forehead protector, the latter of which was worn slightly tilted to the left. The man nodded at the three of them, before cracking a smile. "Well then. Let's get going, shall we?" His tone was jovial, and as they began to walk out of the academy the sensei kept on speaking. "I remember when I was at the academy. I was one of the best students in the class, would have been rookie of the year but Haytake was way better." As the man kept on talking, Naruto found himself slipping into a comfortable position. He hadn't even realized he had been tense just a few minutes prior. The sensei didn't seem that bad. He just wondered what he would learn from him. "Now, I'm sorry to say but I personally don't believe in luck. I mean, we're number 13 but that doesn't mean we have to be unlucky, right? Even though no Team 13 ever passed their exams before, this doesn't change everything." "Excuse me, sensei," Sakura frowned as she caught on something strange their teacher had said. "What do you mean with no Team 13 passed their exams? We already did, didn't we?" "Oh no," Aoba remarked. "You are now shinobi. You aren't yet fully fledged genins. If you fail, you are sent back to the academy and are retrained for the following year." "What?" Sakura screeched, making him wince from the voice the girl had. But then Sasuke-kun would already be, and I wouldn't be able to, no. We have to pass." She tightened her fist in midair, her eyes blaring with determination. "I concur with ugly," Sai remarked, only to receive a fist to the side of the face. "Naruto?" Naruto said nothing. He sighed as he felt the typical feeling of nervousness start to crawl up his skin. This wasn't good. He wanted to pass. No, he had to pass. He didn't know if he would lucky enough the next year to still have Mizuki giving him the examination. If it was someone else, then maybe they might ask something he didn't know and fail him. He couldn't fail 2 years in a row. He just couldn't survive 2 more years like this, in his own personal hell. He had to pass. He would pass, and then he would leave. His eyes brightened with determination, as he stared at the back of his Jounin sensei's head. Maybe if he stared hard enough, he might see what the exam would be like. Their walk ended near the sides of the Konoha library, to where the Konoha's torture and interrogation department began hidden between camouflaged rocks. Aoba merely walked through them, and after a moment of hesitation came back outside, gesturing for them to follow him. Naruto nervously gulped down, before following behind Sakura and Sai. The girl seemed to start worrying, while instead the raven-haired boy wasn't. Sai seemed to be made out of rock, for all the emotions he displayed. He didn't even seem to care that they were entering the bowels of the mountain, or that they were going in the torture and interrogation department of Konoha, where people were tortured. Naruto shuddered as they walked along a pristine white corridor, a scream of pain piercing the air and making Sakura jump backwards in a slight display of fright. He was frightened too, only he froze rather than jump. Anko must be at it, their Jounin-sensei remarked, taking a turn to the right. The scream of pain soon morphed into a set of pitiful sobs, as choked words became more and more distinguishable as they walked closer to its source. Sakura had subtly started to distance herself from their sensei, instead choosing to be between himself and Sai. Sai said nothing and didn't even appear fazed by the screams of pain or the wails of the broken-down shinobis. They finally reached the end of the corridor, where a crossroad seemed to be splitting into 3 different roads within the complex, and one of them ended in an onyx black door that seemed to be standing slightly ajar. "Now wait here while I prepare the exam," Aoba remarked. "Do not, under any circumstance, follow me inside. There are important and vital documents around and you do not have the clearance to look at them. The penalty is death for breaching state secrecy. I'm sure you don't want to end your career this early, right?" As the Jounin jokingly spoke, Naruto slowly shook his head in a nod. Sakura seemed queasy, but quickly nodded too. Sai didn't even move his head. The next moment, they were alone in the corridor. "Do you think it will be hard?" Sakura asked, looking worried at him and Sai. The black-haired genin didn't reply. He uncomfortably stared at the wall near them, hoping the girl wouldn't try and talk to him again. "I asked a question, you know," she spoke once more. "You could answer, jerks." "We were told to wait here, ugly," Sai said. "There is no need to speak." He actually approved of what Sai was saying. They heard the noise of footsteps coming closer from another corridor, and as they all turned to look, a purple-haired kunoichi clad in a most revealing fishnet shirt and long trench coat came into view. The woman was wearing a really short skirt, and seemed to be holding a stick within her mouth, albeit she was displaying a worried face. "What are you 3 doing over here? This isn't a place for academy students." We're waiting for Aoba-sensei." Sakura spoke out, "We're to take the test to become genins." The kunoichi smiled wickedly, before sultrily speaking. "Oh, fresh blood." She licked her lips, "Do you guys want a hint?" "Really?" Sakura's eyes widened as the pink-haired girl smiled. Naruto merely scoffed. People who smiled like that weren't to be trusted. "Oh yes. His tests are always the same multiple choices, Aoba has no imagination, you see. So the correct answer to all of the questions is always the last one. Now excuse me, but I have an escaped prisoner to catch." With those words, the woman clearly left quickly. "Oh." Sakura sighed, "Only that?" she muttered. The girl then returned to stare at the door that was still slightly ajar. She bit her lip as if torn between looking and not looking, and as she hesitantly took a step forward, the hand of Sai clamped down on her shoulder, making her jump in fright. "Where are you going, ugly?" A nervous tick mark appeared on Sakura's forehead, as the pink-haired girl gritted her teeth. "We could take a small peek," she whispered in a low enough voice to hopefully pass unheard. "Just to know how long it will take, Mom is expecting me for dinner after all." "No," Sai remarked. "We wait here. Treachery to a superior officer is punishable by imprisonment or death." "But aren't you curious about it?" Sakura asked back. "No. Not even a little bit." "No. A tiny bit." "No." As the two kept on discussing, Naruto tuned them out. There was an escaped prisoner going around, if what the purple-haired kunoichi had said was true. Still, she had acted a bit too calmly for someone looking for an escaped convict. Shouldn't she have brought them outside to safety? He turned to look at the slightly ajar door. What if the escaped convict was within the room? "We can call Sensei without looking through the crack then," Sakura exclaimed. "That is acceptable." Sai nodded. Naruto merely remained unperturbed as the two moved forward. "Sensei?" Sakura asked cautiously, her voice rising just a bit. "Are you still there?" Yes, I am. Don't come in. The moment their sensei spoke, Sakura added. Will it take long? Not much, you should take care to remember my words. Stop wasting my time. Disturb me again and you will fail. Sakura flinched at the harsh words, but then sulkily turned her back on the door and marched towards the crossroad of corridors. Fine. The girl huffed, crossing her arms over her chest. I'll wait here then. Sai said nothing, instead taking out the white scroll of his and starting to draw on it. Naruto brought up an eyebrow at the sight, quietly watching the dark-haired boy drawing. The silence stretched through the trio for uncomfortably long minutes. The minutes turned into hours, at least to their senses. What are you drawing? Naruto finally blurted out, looking at Sai who seemed surprised to hear him speak. A scenery, dickless. The boy answered. Naruto ignored the dickless word, and moved closer to look. There, drawn in ink, was a sight of the Konoha's mountain monument, with the faces of the four Hokage and even complying with the sketched entrance to the T&I department. You like to draw? Naruto queried. Yes, Sai said, frowning. I enjoy it, but it is distasteful for a shinobi to enjoy such things. Oh. Naruto muttered, with his back leaning against the wall. Is he going to take much longer? Sakura muttered, making Naruto tense since he hadn't heard her move closer to them. I need to go and freshen myself up. We cannot ask him, or he will fail us. Sai commented. I thought you understood that, ugly. The nervous tick mark on Sakura's forehead reappeared, but was soon squashed down by the girl holding onto her stomach with a slightly worried look. I really need the freshening. She whimpered. If we exclude the corridor we walked in from, Naruto spoke then, it leaves us with two other corridors to explore. He added, pointing to the one where the kunoichi had come from and the other one perpendicular to it. One might hold the torture cells, he dryly remarked, but the other is an unknown. I can have them checked, dickless. Sai remarked then, grabbing a clean parchment and slowly drawing small images of mice. A hand sign later, and the mice actually emerged from the scroll and scampered down on the floor. The ink animals began to run across the empty corridors, not making any sound as they went. That's pretty cool. Sakura muttered in awe, before her face suddenly morphed into one of worry and grief. The girl then shook her head and returned to her I am definitively not worried about an exam face. Naruto knew what the girl was thinking, instead. He knew because he was thinking the same thing too, what if he was the unprepared one? He had been happy in passing the exam, but what skills did he have? He had nothing. He had an unworkable bunshin. A pitiful taijutsu stance and few props in hitting things with shurikens. The only thing he was good at was with his stamina, and only recently on theoretical practice. He didn't even want to know what the exam was, and it had been hours since they had last seen their sensei. Finally, the mice came back, and Sai directed Sakura to where the toilets were. The girl seemed relieved and really freshened up the moment she came back, but the waiting game kept being played. In the end, the three of them stood with their backs against the wall, waiting and sighing heavily as their eyes began to feel droopy. What time is it? Sakura blearily asked. I don't know. Naruto replied. My parents are going to be worried. The blonde-haired boy said nothing, albeit hearing that didn't make him feel well at all. It was as if the girl enjoyed twisting the rusty kunai in his wounds. You know, they always told me to stay away from you because you were a bad kid. Sakura commented. You don't look bad though. He snorted, but said nothing again. He's dickless, he can't be bad if he doesn't have a dick. Sai piped in from his side. Strangely, those words actually made Naruto crack a small smile. So you're bad then, Sai? You have a dick, right? We are not measuring dicks, dickless. Sai remarked, keeping his smile on. Immature, both of you. In front of a lady Sakura had barely begun talking, that the door cracked open to reveal a puzzled Aoba. Well. The three of them stood up, eagerly waiting for the exam to start. You fail. And with that, their dreams were crushed in the most brutal manner possible. Chapter 2, Finding One's Weakness. You fail. With those two words, The world fell on Naruto's shoulders. Sakura was misty-eyed, her shoulders trembling as she brought her hands up to cover her mouth. Sai said nothing, merely looking with his emotionless face to their Jounin-sensei. Why? Sakura choked out. Aoba raised an eyebrow, before gesturing with his right hand in a wide arc. You failed at everything. The Jounin took a deep breath, and then added. You were told there was an escaped convict. Yet you did not feel the need to tell me, did you? Naruto breathed in slowly. The man was right. They had been told of an escaped prisoner, and hadn't even tried to warn their sensei about him, for fear of being disqualified from the exam. Furthermore, you left your teammate to go alone into unknown territory, with the possible presence of hostiles. Aoba added then, while you did scout ahead and you did display a slight understanding of the complex map, you failed to take into account the hostile presence. You also failed to maintain a status of readiness in case of attack. Had there really been a hostile shinobi, and had he found you, he would have clearly managed to take one of you hostage. Naruto began to grind his teeth, as the words of the man rung true in his ears. What happens now? Sakura asked, tears streaking down her eyes. Now you'll be sent back to the academy, to repeat your year. Aoba remarked, or you may drop out of the program completely. No. Sakura exclaimed, I'm not dropping out. I'll do better next time. Shut up, ugly, Sai commented. As Sakura brought both of her hands to cover her face and Sai emotionlessly stared at her crying, Naruto just looked with a sad gaze at the girl. He didn't even feel the need to yell or rant. He just dropped his shoulders slightly, and sighed. His eyes stung slightly, from the failure and the embarrassment, but he did not speak. It wouldn't have changed anything. There is another way, however. Aoba remarked, you may try the Konoha boot camp. Sakura's teary emerald eyes came up, as she looked in surprise at their sensei. Naruto frowned, he had never heard of that before. Sai said and did nothing. It is a highly intensive coursework, designed to get the failed shinobis to become productive as fast as possible. It basically sends you to the Genin Corps, and by the time it is over you will become sensei-less Genins. It is a 3-month course, but it's not pretty at all. The Jounin remarked. There are training casualties every year. We'll do it, Sakura said, her eyes now shining with determination. Naruto tensed slightly, before turning his gaze to Aoba, who merely looked back at him. There was a slight frown on his mouth, the same that usually came when an adult looked at him and was about to say something scathing. I'll take it too, he suddenly added. If Dickless takes it, then so will I. Sai commented. Very well, the Jounin said. Pack lightly and find yourself, tomorrow at 7 o'clock, in front of Konoha's gates. I will sign you in. Now let's get you out of here. With those words, Aoba began to walk out. He did not try to joke on the situation, or make up some sort of hopeful term. It was silence, only silence, that followed them like a blanket as they left. Naruto walked outside, looking at the sky now colored red and orange for the dying sun, and couldn't help but feel a heavy weight on his stomach. He had failed. He would never be someone special, or important, if this kept up. He would become a sensei-less Genin, one of the many, an unknown face in the midst of hundreds. Still, as he clenched his fists, his eyes traveled to the downcast Sakura and the still emotionless Sai. Would you like to go to Ichiraku's? He found himself asking his two teammates. My parents will be worried for me now. Sakura commented, before quietly leaving them behind without saying a word. Naruto turned to Sai, who merely plastered on his fake smile and then replied. I cannot, Dickless. Then the boy walked away, leaving him alone. Naruto merely breathed in slowly once more, before quietly walking back home. There really was no need to go to Ichiraku's. There was no need to wallow in self-pity. He had to prepare for the next morning and whatever boot camp there was. The Jounin had said to pack lightly, and considering the few things he had, he doubted he had to pack more than he could carry. As Naruto was thinking on what to bring, Aoba was instead reporting to the Hokage within his office. The third Hokage was smoking his pipe, a heavy frown marring his face. His left hand was gently caressing his goatee, while his right one was scribbling something down with a brush on a scroll. So why did you feel the need to offer them the bootcamp option? Hokage-sama, you instructed me to test them as equally as possible, Aoba remarked. The bootcamp is the most equal of testing options. It is also the longest and most difficult, Hiruzen said, a small smile on his lips. This has nothing to do with your history, does it? Indeed. Aoba stiffened, if slightly. If their desire to become a shinobi of Konoha is that strong, then going back to the academy would be a waste, unprepared or not as they are, D ranks would suffice to get them on par eventually. That of course matters only if they survive, there is a reason the bootcamp option has long since been unused. The third Hokage stood up from his desk, heading calmly in front of Aoba. You are not doing this because of Naruto, are you? He asked. I can change the assigned sensei, if that is the case. Of course not, Hokage-sama. Aoba replied, Jinhuriki or not, a shinobi of Konoha is a comrade. I won't deliberately make things worse for him, but bootcamp is bootcamp. Hiruzen merely hummed back his approval, before turning and heading back to his desk. I'll get the others ready. Dismissed. With that word, Aoba disappeared in a shunshin motion. The sky was outright stormy when the three failures found themselves near the gates of Konoha, all properly chastised. Sakura had a slightly broken lip, probably from the nervousness of what camp entailed, while Sai seemed his own emotionless self. Naruto merely looked at the two of them with an awry smile. He had expected more people to have failed, but as time passed it apparently became clear that they had been the only one not to become genins. Ino came by this morning to flaunt how she passed yesterday, Sakura mumbled, her eyes downcast. She just had to talk with their sensei, and she passed like that. The girl's voice seemed slightly cracked, but he merely stared at her in disbelief. Sai said nothing, his eyes for once strangely showing a glint of worry, most likely because of the storm and the scroll he was drawing on, rather than because of Sakura's words. Naruto looked hesitant, as he spoke. Well, that sucks. It sounded lame as a consolation wording, but it wasn't as if anyone had ever tried and consoled him to begin with, he was in new and uncharted territory. There was a faraway sound of a thunder, soon followed by an increase in the wind's intensity. It probably was just a summer storm, but having to wait for their sensei and the downpour that was certainly going to follow wasn't an endearing perspective. Sakura didn't reply again to him, effectively ending the conversation. Silence descended once more, interrupted only at a certain moment by Sai placing his scroll into his small backpack, and then starting to check on it. Naruto widened his eyes and then did the same. It was written to always double-check your supplies before leaving. He had ninja wire, a few kunaus, a dozen of shurikens and a few supply pills. He also had dried meat and loaves of rock-hard bread that could probably double as a weapon. 2 flasks containing water and a third one containing a basic alcohol for disinfecting purposes. Thread and needle, to suture wounds, and gauze. The rest, as shinobis, they were expected to scavenge along the way. Naruto had double-checked his list of equipment together with the academy manual on supplies, and he was pretty sure he was packed and ready to go. He eyed Sakura, and was sort of amused that she too had the same surprised look in actually recalling what they were supposed to do before leaving the village. A few minutes later, an Aoba appeared out of thin air in front of them, in a tornado of leaves. Very well. The Jounin remarked offhandedly. Naruto narrowed his eyes, the man had been spying on them, just like the day before. It seems you are the only failure of your generation, but at least you have some basics firmly down. The man's voice was harsher and gruffer, his eyes showing some sort of glare that made Naruto freeze. He hated those glares. He hated and was scared by them in the same amount. Those were the glares of the uncaring eyes, which don't care if you are crying for a broken bone, a dead puppy, or the dying rants of a nearby man. Those were the eyes he loathed. I will be sufficient as your instructor for boot camp. Now, this is your last warning. If you don't want to go, then you may say so now, and you will be able to enter the academy's new year as if nothing happened. On the other hand, if you thoroughly decide to piss me off and have me waste 3 months of my life in training you to the bone, I can guarantee you will not have a happy time. The voice was practically a growl by then, and somehow Sakura had begun trembling at that. The loud boom of another thunder struck at the same time the soft pit-patter of rain began to fall. In the silence that followed, Sai was the first to speak. I'm waiting to start camp, four-eyed sensei. As the glare of the Jounin was directed towards the emotionless and pale-skinned genin, Naruto found himself breathing harshly, as he coughed out the words his tongue refused to say. I'm in. Nothing would change after all, whether he went and was hated by the Jounin or he remained and was hated by Konoha. What was the difference? Hate for hate, he at least would rather get the 3 months of hell. Sakura seemed torn, her eyes going from Naruto to Sai and backwards, before finally settling on their sensei. She was about to speak, when the sight of another team of genins caught her eyes and made her still. Naruto eyed with surprise the incoming team of Shikamaru, Chuji, and Ino, who were apparently led by Asuma Sarutobi to deliver something to the gates. I'm in too, sensei. We can go. She immediately blurted out, her face morphing into an extremely hard and certain one, her arms crossed over her chest as she harumphed her desire to learn. Very well, we can Ohi. Forward. Ino yelled, having probably seen them. Like a doe caught in the light, Naruto saw Sakura freeze and stare with slightly wide-eyed fright at the incoming blonde girl. Going off to get your ass kicked. Suck on it, pig. Sakura retorted, somehow getting back her fighting spirit. I'm going to make Sasuke fall for me. You just wait and see. Ha. As if he'd want a failure like you. Ino taunted back, only for Sakura to retort. At least I'll get stronger than you, Ino pig. Forward girl. Pig. Harano, silence. At the words of Aoba, Sakura was properly chastised and kept quiet. This is unbecoming of a shinobi or a kunoichi, to yell out in the streets. His wording was precise, but it dripped with venom as the Jounin spoke. Let us go, now. Those words said, Aoba began to walk out of Konoha's gates just as the first drops of rain turned into the veritable downpour they had all been waiting for. Hurriedly running behind the Jounin, Naruto ground his teeth as he tried to cover his head with the backpack. Boot camp is not far from the village. Aoba retorted, as he kept on walking apparently unfazed by the ground turning muddy. The seasonal rainstorm didn't seem to be dropping in intensity, the heavy drizzle obscuring vision and drenching them in the cold water. It seemed like hours, before they finally stopped in what seemed like the middle of the forest, with only a gravy path and a torii gate colored red. The kanjis for boot camp were inscribed in inked black on the summit of the gate, 2 statues of lions standing at its sides. I'll be up ahead, be quick. This area is usually riddled with bandits during the summer, since it's an unused facility in the middle of the forest. A shrug later and Aoba was gone, leaving the 3 of them in the middle of the downpour. Bandits. Sakura huffed and wheezed, her hair sleek and attached to her face. She was forcefully pushing it behind, but every time she sharply turned it slapped against her, making it useless to try. This still didn't stop her from doing it, however. Yes, ugly, bandits. Sai's words weren't met with a fist, probably because Sakura was too tired to even think about hitting the boy. Naruto shuddered from the cold wind, as it settled against his wet clothes and skin. They were going to get a horrible cold or worse if they stayed under the downpour for much longer. Another flash of light and the sound of thunder came at them, blinding and deafening them momentarily. Naruto took a step forward, his sandal hitting the gravel of the path with a satisfying crunch noise. He wearily sighed. We have to go. As they began to walk on the path, their sandals began to fill with the bothersome gravel, forcing them to make many stops along the road to remove them. Arg. This is hell. Sakura whined. Do we have to stay on the path? No, ugly, can you climb trees? Sai retorted, heading to the closest tree and climbing on it, deftly using his hands to get to the lowest branch and then jumping to the other one. How did you do that? Sakura exclaimed in surprise, her eyes narrow to manage to catch a glimpse of the boy's actions. Practice. The raven-haired boy replied. You can climb trees, right? Of course I can. Sakura huffed. It's one of the things they teach at the academy. Naruto watched as the girl slowly but surely climbed upwards. Not using anything reckless like jumps, and rather being certain of her footing before taking a step up, she managed to get on the lowest branch too and then jump towards the other tree. She drastically overcompensated, flailing her arms as she was falling against the ground hard. Sai jumped out of his branch, holding himself up only by his legs in a display of acrobatics worthy of the circus. Naruto stared wide-eyed at that. Maybe the boy was a circus child? He quickly scampered closer to where the girl was, just in time as the raven-haired boy dropped the slippery arm of Sakura. The girl fell down with a startled cry, but Naruto's arms grabbed the falling body. The next instant the blonde boy fell on the ground, the girl literally on top of him, having elbowed his stomach during the fall. He groaned and winced in pain, as he felt his breakfast start to climb its way upwards. Sai jumped down a moment later, before commenting. Trees are out for ugly and dickless. With a huff and another groan, Naruto got back up clutching his stomach. That hurt. I'm sorry. Sakura blurted out, her gaze worried. Did I crack one of your ribs or anything? No, I'm fine. He sucked in air sharply, shaking his head. The pain was something that quickly disappeared within him, same courtesy did broken bones, wounds, sprained muscles and even concussions. He probably had developed this sort of self-defense mechanism with the times he had been left alone to fend for himself back at the orphanage. He grumbled as they began to walk once more on the gravel path. A few minutes later, with a groan of frustration, Sakura removed her sandals and grabbed them with her hands. I can't take this anymore. What is wrong with this? She yelled. Walking in the rain. Ino bitch just had to talk to her sensei and we get saddled with boot camp and a grim future. Life's not fair but this is SH. A loud thunder soon followed with a blinding light, forcing them to close their eyes as the sound of a tree falling reached their ears. The sudden bask of warmth forced Naruto to snap his eyes open and stare at the fallen tree that was now blocking the road. Fire spread through the trunk, as if the lightning bolt had struck through it within mere seconds. He widened his eyes as he stared at where Sakura was. Her body was on the ground and the girl was moaning from the pain. She had probably been pushed backward by the lightning striking the tree, and had landed harshly on the gravel. This is bad, dickless. Sai commented. We need shelter. Yeah. He replied, before turning to where Sakura was. Can you walk, Sakura? I think I sprained my ankle. The girl replied as she tried, and failed, to stand back up. Naruto slumped his shoulders, before helping the girl up and, just like the manual on shinobi arts said, placing her right arm around his shoulders as she lifted the sprained right ankle. My feet hurt. She blurted out again. It's better if you put your sandals back on. He found himself saying. We're probably going to have to take a detour, and if there are any snakes around. She winced, but simply followed his words. Following Sai at a slower pace they began to walk around the burning tree, past some extremely thick wooden trunks and, back to the gravel path. Their walk lasted for a few more minutes, before Naruto heard Sakura start to murmur again. How far off is the camp to begin with? We've been walking for ages. It can't be that far. He offered back as an answer. Sensei wouldn't have left us if it took that long to reach camp. Maybe you could leave me here. Sakura offered, eyeing a trunk nearby. You can run up ahead and... You remember Sensei's words on bandits? Naruto retorted, with an awry face. We already failed once because of something similar, I learned the lesson. Had nothing else to think about back in the house. The what-ifs and what they had done wrong had plagued him for most of the silent time he had spent within his one-room apartment. Things that he would have changed, had he the chance to, things that he would have done instead of not, they all brought forth the simple conclusion that he should have just been attentive to his surroundings. If somebody said there was a risk for an enemy, then the most intelligent thing to do was to be careful about it, not ignore it just because you felt safe at the moment. He knew that now, and it was a mistake he wouldn't be doing again. Furthermore, it wasn't as if Sakura waited much, and he had stamina to burn. You know, Dickless, if bandits attacked us we would be dead. Sai remarked then, interrupting his silent behavior to deliver his ray of sunshine in the situation. My ink is not effective and my kenjutsu is still amateurish. I'm nearly dead last. I don't know how good of a fight I could put against a bandit to begin with. Naruto replied truthfully, as the sudden tensing of Sakura made him turn his puzzled gaze forward. There was a crevice in the ground, beneath which a tumultuous river was currently flowing. The bridge that traveled from one side to the other was broken, the ropes torn and the wooden planks banging against the other side of the crevice. The only way through appeared to be by actually descending along the walls, passing the river and then reaching for the other side. Under the thunderstorm, such a thing was tantamount to suicide. "What do we do now?" Naruto asked, his gaze wide in disbelief for the horrible situation they had landed in. "We could wait for Sensei to come and look for us," Sakura replied uneasily. "There might be another bridge," Sai pointed out. "The gravel path splits." The boy added, his fingers pointing at where the gravel did seem to turn towards the deeper areas of the forest. "Let's go then." He gulped down nervously, as he readjusted Sakura's weight and began once more to walk. Sai was slightly ahead of them, keeping an eye out for the path. The incessant downpour was slowly dying out, much to his relief. He didn't know how long he could have kept on, thoroughly drenched as he was in the freezing rain. "Stop." Sai's word stilled him, and when the boy gestured for them out of the path, he obeyed as fast as he could while carrying Sakura with him. His breathing slowed down, as with the rain settling the sound of boots scrunching on the gravel came stronger to his ears. His heart began to beat faster, as the feeling of dread pooled within his body. The pairs of feet were coming closer. 2 bandits, one of them holding a katana on his shoulder, were coming along the path talking to one another. Just like with any summer storm, the rain ended up abruptly, and the voice of the 2 bandits was carried onto their ears. "Man, we're going to be paid big time now," the burly-looking bandit of the 2 commented, a Konoha Jounin, knocked out and ready to deliver. "We're going to be rich. I can't wait to get myself a geisha or 2. The other rolled his eyes. "You have nothing better to do but yell that." The tip of a ceramic bottle found its way to the bandit's mouth, the probably alcoholic beverage within being gulped down avidly. "I mean, what if they send someone to free him? They won't get here in time, the boss got him ready and packed to go. He'll be gone in less than 2 hours tops." To those words, Naruto's breath hitched. He felt Sakura's hand clench against his jacket, the unspoken terror clearly rippling out of her tense body. Sai remained emotionless, but a small downward frown marred his usually stoic face. Probably the capture of a Jounin was something that got through even him. Jounins were supposed to be high-level ninjas, and for one to be captured alive, it just meant that either their instructor had gotten extremely unlucky, or that the bandits' boss was someone not to be trifled with. The 2 bandits walked by, soon disappearing from view down the road. "What do we do?" Sakura whispered fervently. "What the hell do we do?" "We go back," Sai intoned. "We warn the Hokage. He will send a relief team. Our sensei is going to be taken away in 2 hours." Sakura hissed back. "We know nothing, ugly," Sai replied calmly. "We go in blind, deaf, and without plan, we die. Dickless, you understand me?" He tensed slightly. He didn't want to die. On the other hand, being a shinobi meant being ready to die for your country. In this situation, this wasn't a situation for genins. This was a situation for jounins, umbus, for whoever was ready to take it. Academy graduates shouldn't be trying to save their jounin from something like this. "We can't leave him here," Sakura hissed again. "It's not right." "Ugly," Sai retorted in a low voice, "you are wounded. The bandits are more than us. We have no way of saving our sensei, we should retreat." "What about just freeing him?" Naruto blinked as Sakura talked once more. "He was probably caught by luck alone. If we free him, he can get us out of here. And if he can't, ugly, we will die." Sakura groaned, shaking her head as she bit her lip. Naruto closed his eyes, hoping against all odds for a solution. "They work in pairs," he commented suddenly. "Sai, you can do the henge, right?" Sai brought up an eyebrow, before slowly nodding. The 2 guys who passed by. "Can you copy the guy with the katana? I'll henge into the other one, and we'll bring Sakura in as a prisoner to get to the cells. We get to where sensei is and we look at the situation. You can use those mice of yours to scout ahead now since it stopped raining, and also we know where they keep Aoba-san. If we can't save him, Dickless?" Sai asked, slowly bringing up an eyebrow. "Then we." He gulped anxiously, closing his eyes, "We find a way to delay them and get out of there." We could die. Sai's reply came calmly, without even a hint or a shred of emotion. We might have to kill. He added then, are you fine with that, dickless? We're shinobis. Naruto replied, his saliva sticking to his throat, as every word he spoke felt like lead. It's what we have to do. What about you, ugly? Sai asked then, his gaze moving to Sakura. Still ready for it? Why? She closed her eyes and her breathing began to hitch, as if she was just about to. The next instant, Sakura retched on the floor, the tension turning too much for her. She staggered and nearly fell on her own pool of vomit, hadn't it been for Naruto's swift tightening of his hold on her to avoid that. The blonde-haired boy sighed, and looked at Sai while shaking his head. We could leave her here, Naruto remarked. Or send her back to Konoha. No, the girl replied, cutting in on their conversation. I'm fine. We can do this, she hastily added. Let's do this. And with those words, the three of them prepared for their plans. Meanwhile, within the bandit camp that was barely held together with sticks and mud, Aoba was calmly standing bound by ropes and feigning unconsciousness. Seems they chose to come and rescue your sorry ass. The voice of one of the patrolling bandits rung in the room. Really, of all the methods to test genins, the boot camp one? Thing is damn horrid, man. Keep your roles, Aoba hissed with his eyes closed. Do you understand me? Yeah. The voice replied, as the katana-wielding bandit merely changed its henge, another equally gruff bandit sort. His colleague did the same, and soon the two of them stood guard as they watched an ink mouse silently make its way towards them. Avoiding the puddles, it headed towards the two guards who were now currently trying their best not to snicker. In their eyes, the attempt was poor. They were Chunin, however, and faking being guards was better than merely sitting at the gates and waiting. They had of course known where the three had hidden behind the tree, and they had quickly gone back to camp the moment they had been out of sight. It was actually sort of endearing, seeing three academy students think they stood a chance. Technically speaking, they were at the present hanging on a loose thread. There was only one way they could pass the exam now, and that way was to not get caught while freeing their sensei. While morally questionable, going back to Konoha to get aid would have been within the laws, and granted them passage. Not going back to Konoha in order to save their sensei was something to be proud of morally. But it was worthy of pass grade only if they actually saved him. If they didn't, then it was all for naught. The mouse walked back and soon disappeared from sight, leaving the two fake brigands to stare at one another with a sort of knowing glance. Let's prepare their reception then. The mouse actually came back to the trio of hopeful genins and morphed into ink and then letters, describing upon the scroll the position of the sensei and of the enemies along the complex. There are at least 17 guards going around the camp. Sakura hissed as she looked at the map, her gaze then heading over to where the camp actually was. It was a wooden fort with a low palisade and a couple of wood buildings. The smaller of which served also as a prison, on the other side of the fort's location. The palisade is low, we can climb over it. Naruto suggested, his eyes fixed on the moving red points. The ink mice of Sai were actually deadly useful. It was a surprise this was an E-rank jutsu. Probably the boy had a shinobi relative, or otherwise was an extremely skilled graduate. He had been homeschooled, hadn't he? He felt a slight pang of envy at the notion. Sakura had left the academy with the highest grades, the raven-haired boy was homeschooled, and he could barely make two nearly dead buns hints. The patrols are tight, Sai replied. We can get in, but we need a distraction for getting out. Maybe you should leave me outside. Sakura murmured, with one of Sai's colored scrolls. I mean, you two get back in after patrol, and as soon as you head over the guys I pour chakra into the things. People get distracted and you get in and out. I can't really walk with a sprained ankle. If only we had radios, you could work as our oversight. Naruto muttered, pushing his right hand through his hair. Tell us where the patrols are from a vantage point and so on. Radios like these, dickless. Sai remarked, putting his hand into his backpack, and taking out a small plastic bag with a set for 3 radios. Naruto blinked. I'm an idiot. He admitted. What else do you have in your bag? Sai blinked back, before slowly opening it up for the other two to see. Somehow, The gleeful look on Naruto's face told the NE failure that maybe, just maybe, he had unleashed something he shouldn't have. Shinobu Mabuya was a Chiryunin of Konohagaku no Sato. As a Chiryunin, they were subjected regularly to tests, examinations, and drills. Sometimes, infiltration practices happened at the same time Genin or other Chiryunin tests took place. The Chiryunins were also asked to stand in during Jounin-level drills, where not being seen by opponent was a key part of the test and killing was prohibited. As it was, he was standing guard at the gate with an equally hunged Izumo, hoping that the Genins that had to pass would not try and get in from the main entrance. He had barely expected them to actually get in unnoticed. He hadn't expected the smoke bomb, the hail of shurikens and what looked like a big black lion pushing through the main wooden gate and disappearing within the complex, roaring as it went. Having to act like a brigand rather than a highly trained shinobi, instead of using his reaction instincts to merely put in place a kawarimi, he was forced to bring his hands in a cross shape in front of his face, suffer the shuriken's blows and then feign being dead with an aptly placed henge. Izumo suffered the same fate, and soon the sounds of people yelling brigand-like sentences echoed through the camp. He frowned slightly. The noises were a bit too high to be normal, either the academy graduates had left the place to highly trained shinobis, or something was definitively amiss. Another set of explosions rang in his ears as he cracked open an eye to stare into a second ink lion who dashed off away from camp with a partner of the same species. He frowned. That didn't make sense. Slowly, the buzz in his ears opened up, and the communication from the standing officer in charge of the boot camp method came through. I don't know if I should send you all back to the academy or not. Mission's over. Shinobu stood up and blinked. He looked at Izumo's perplexed face as the other Chiryunin began to walk in the complex. He was trying to understand just what had happened when he stood near the side of the prison for Aoba. Entangled in a mess of ninja wire were 4 Chiryunins of Konoha, while the 2 guards who were meant to be on guard duty were slightly charred, and the other wood building was also nicely burning as if somebody had set fire to it. Did you know that smoke bombs and alcohol-infused ink are flammable materials? The voice of Katetsu, Izumo's usual partner, rang from their side. They turned to meet the amused glance of the Chiryunin, who shook his head and took a deep breath. I don't know how they did that, but in a second we were swarmed with exploding and flaming mice that distracted us, while what we considered the diversion actually was the main attack, entered, kidnapped Aoba, and then left through the main gate. The ink lions. Shinobu found himself asking, half intrigued and half surprised. There was one of the genins, the pale-skinned one, inside. He got to their sensei and drew another lion to get him out. Since we thought a frontal attack was suicidal, we believed it just a diversion. The second genin, the Jinhyuriki, he was a piece of work. He actually nearly sliced the throat of Sayotome. We didn't see him, but when we caught a glimpse and followed him in the alley. He pointed at the entangled mess of shinobis, that was what we were met with. And the girl? Izumo asked. She was on the lookout, binoculars and radio out. We couldn't think about going on her side, because she was well hidden on top of the tree branches, and the Jinhyuriki had already gone and taken her out of there. They got us nice and easy. So it's a pass for them and a fail for us. Shinobu remarked, his shoulders dropping. Team 13-2, it's the first in how long? Katetsu turned thoughtful as he asked the question, before answering himself, 5, 10 years. I think it was 9. Meanwhile, Aoba finally opened his eyes, coming out of his fake knocked-out disposition to look at his 3 students making camp near a covered fire, after having dug a ditch in the ground and placed some branches and leaves to cover the light. Huddled together, their grim faces actually gave the impression of shell-shocked soldiers than that of children. He knew it sounded cold-hearted, but he had truly expected for them to fail. He had sincerely hoped they would just do anything that would look bad if written on a report, so that he could fail them. Either for lack of teamwork, or for having left a Jounin of Konoha behind, or something like that. He hadn't thought they would have actually managed to save him, and the way the Jinhyuriki, Naruto, was shivering, made him think it wasn't just because of the wet clothes. You're awake, sensei. Sai commented, and just as suddenly the heads of both Naruto and Sakura snapped to meet his gaze. The eyes weren't there to look at him in relief, they were accusing glares. There was no one in the camp that could have captured you, Sensei. Naruto's hissed voice had that sort of strangled tone that belonged to someone who was barely reining in his anger. And you're without a wound. The brigands had a pretty distinctive walk pattern. Sai quipped in, shinobi-like, to describe it. I also saw them from my position, Sensei. Some of them dropped the henge when Naruto was out of there. Sakura whispered. Did you just want to fail us, Sensei? Naruto's voice asked, and for once Aoba was actually struck speechless. He had indeed planned something like that. Is it because of me? Of course it wasn't because Naruto Uzumaki was the Jinchuriki of the Kyuubi no Kitsune, but merely because their grades shouldn't have made them able to even graduate, at least not during his times. He was trying to do them a favor. He was just trying to get them to back off the shinobi business unless more adequately prepared. His silence was taken as an affirmative answer, because the Uzumaki's shoulders slumped down, and his eyes looked downcast. Oh. The boy mumbled, his hands clenching slightly as he took a deep breath. What did I do to you? He asked, the other two students standing by his side in a perplexed yet respectful silence. What did I do to all of you? Naruto's next question was hissed, so hard was his desire not to make noise, maybe to avoid attracting attention in case the test was still on. Why do you all hate my fucking guts? Aoba took a deep breath, and then stood in a sitting position. I cannot tell you this, Naruto. The man began calmly, pulling his glasses off his face to clean them. Before the boy could actually scream at him, he hastily added. You have to ask the Hokage about it. The sour face of Naruto told him the boy wasn't going to be satisfied with that, but it was the best he could do. You will see him soon enough though, you all passed the test. You haven't answered our previous question, Sensei. Sai piped in again, calmly looking at him without a shred of either interest or boredom, just looking. No. I did not want to fail you because of Naruto. I wanted to fail all of you because, in my opinion, you were not ready for the shinobi world. His reply was met with a short gasp by Sakura, while Naruto's face merely steeled itself. Sai neither said nor reacted in any way. That did make him curious, how was it possible for a graduate to school his features so well? But I was the first in class. Sakura exclaimed. But during physical you were among the last. He rebuffed the girl. Naruto here was the last of his class throughout most of the academy, and even though he improved, he still came pretty close to the dead last position. In the silence that descended, Aoba found himself speaking once more to add another bit. The only exclusion would be Sai here, his grades were par with those of Sasuke, your rookie of the year. I would have suggested taking on an apprenticeship with an available jounin rather than repeat the school year. Sakura's eyes were filled with tears, but Naruto's gaze, that actually was what made him wince. It was empty. It was as if it didn't matter that he had actually passed. He wasn't throwing himself in the air cheering and he wasn't actually caring about what he had said moments ago. He was just there. We should be going back to Konoha. Aoba remarked, standing up. Without even saying a word, he was surprised by both Naruto and Sai moving to flank Sakura and help her up. You sprained an ankle? He asked then, and as the girl stammered an affirmative reply he knelt in front of her feet and began to circulate the healing chakra from his hands onto her wounded area. The foot had been bandaged and held still with shinobi wire and gauze, as if it had been broken rather than just sprained. There. He said, all set. Gingerly bringing weight back on the foot, Sakura sighed in relief before slipping on her sandals. We can reach Konoha by nightfall if we hurry. He didn't want to admit it, even to himself, but the look of the Uzumaki's child. It had to be brought up to the Hokage as soon as possible. He knew enough to know that closing oneself off, especially for a shinobi, was dangerous. All the pent-up anger eventually had to be unleashed in some way or form. The small outburst of before, while clearly something to frown upon for a shinobi, was a clear indicator that things with Naruto were reaching a very dangerous breaking point. If the Jinchuriki broke, then what of the Baijuya? Chapter 3, The Team is Born. Chapter 3. The one-room apartment looked just like he had left it that morning, when he finally came back in the middle of the night. He slowly dropped his backpack in the corner, closing the door behind him with a dull thud. The room was silent, like always. "How are you doing?" he asked to no one in particular. "Oh, I'm fine," he replied, his voice slightly bitter. "I've just discovered my sensei wanted me to fail." He shook his head, muttering under his breath. "Of course they all hate me, what was I hoping for? A miracle." He kicked off his sandals, wincing as the pain from his bleeding feet hit him. He just cursed slightly, sure that after the fourth step he would stop feeling the pain. He had always healed that fast. "At least I have something of worth, I can be the meat shield," he grumbled. He removed his jacket, completely drenched in a mixture of rainwater and sweat. He flung it in another corner, soon followed by his shorts and the rest of his wet clothes. He should have taken a shower, before putting on his pajama. The problem was that the baths in the complex were already closed. It was a one-room apartment for a reason after all. There was a bath for every floor, and it worked on an hourly basis. He had the last hours of the early morning, so the sweet pleasures of hot water had been removed from his meager pleasures in life from the very beginning. Naruto didn't care, he felt tired, which considering he usually could outrun all of his classmates meant that he really was at his limits. Sakura had to be carried home by their sensei, since the kunoichi collapsed halfway. Sai had managed to reach Konoha, and had then disappeared only he knew where in the midst of the dark alleys. At night the village was so peaceful. He fell with a soft thud on his mattress. No worries clouding his mind. The next moment, just as his peaceful snoring filled the room, a shadow slinked out from the corner. A kunao barely glinted in the moonlight, its form poised to strike. Silently, without even making the slightest of sounds, the kunao fell down on the tired and sleeping form of Naruto. Naruto Uzumaki awoke with a startled cry from his nightmare, the cheerful light of the sun's rays illuminating his room. The chirps of the birds were somewhat drowned by the bustling city's noises, but that didn't stop the small flock from trying its hardest to sing. He sighed, bringing his body back down on the bed as he breathed once more calmly. He brought his right hand over his face, covering it as he felt the cold sweat trickle down his body. He moved to the side of the bed, checking at the clock and then tiredly standing up. He had 5 minutes to go before his shower time, he could start on the breakfast. He opened the fridge, half hoping he had a cup of instant ramen somewhere, but knowing all too well that within the white machinery only air remained. He opened the cupboards, and was met with the desolate scenery of nothingness. The orphans had a stipend from the state, provided they entered the ninja academy. Entering the shinobi program granted you a few benefits, among which one was the usage of the one-room apartments reserved to homeless ninjas. The orphanage really wasn't the place to leave weapons for training around, and he didn't trust the matrons themselves from taking everything he had away from him. It happened all too many times, having the food nicked when he was just about to eat it. One of the reasons he scarfed it down as fast as he could, whenever he had it, you never know when someone else might take it. He ignored the rumbling of his stomachs. He could always believe himself into a diet, like one of those ultra-skinny models that had their posters hanging around town. He grabbed the towel and the industrial-quality soap, before heading off. Of course the water was not only running by the time he got there, but also freezing cold. One day, he would fix the pipes and the bastard who had the hour before him for the shower. Till then, he had no choice but to let it run. No matter how much you yelled, people that didn't want to listen wouldn't. It took him a few moments, before gathering enough courage to just plunge head in and scrub as fast as he could. The cold and icy feeling of the liquid made him clatter his teeth by the time he was done, and as he speedily went out and covered himself with the towel, he was just glad it was the summer period. During winter, he usually brought the pans of water back in the apartment to heat them, and then walked back to the showers to use them. He finally returned to his room, grabbing some clean clothes and putting them on. This time he was wearing a soft maroon tint as a jacket, a light gray shirt underneath and a pair of dark brown shorts. He could basically press himself against any wall of the village and appear as part of the scenery. He had done that once. It actually worked because his blonde hair hid well with the lighter shades of beige the walls were tinted in. He then fastened the forehead protector, this time on his left shoulder, before heading out. It was in that moment that he realized that their sensei hadn't actually given them a place to meet. He racked his brain, but since the man hadn't actually said anything, he took a deep breath, and then his cerulean eyes settled on the Hokage's tower. There was a confrontation he couldn't avoid now. The Hokage knew the reason, and now was as good as any time to have an answer. He began to walk in that direction, calmly but with a purposeful stride. People don't tend to watch too long moving objects that aren't going in their directions. They also don't like to look at glinting things in the sunlight, which meant that he actually had people averting their gazes from him as he walked. The fact he had purposefully placed the forehead protector where it could glint was just a coincidence, of course. All too soon, the Hokage tower came into view. His stomach grumbled slightly as the thought of actually talking with the old man started to sound less and less appealing. Without money, it wasn't as if he could go to Ichiraku, however. He breathed in and out evenly, trying to calm his erratically beating heart as he began to walk once more. The stairs seemed so long, but by the time he reached the end of them, the Hokage's office stood in view with the door slightly ajar. He carefully crept towards it, knocking softly before taking a hesitant peek inside at the same time. "Hokage-sama?" he asked. "Naruto," the Sandaime replied with a small smirk in a warm tone. "Please, come in." He did just that. The office of the Sandaime was something he had grown accustomed to a long time before. Yet with the passing of months he had stopped visiting it as usual. The old man behind the desk was the most powerful shinobi of the entire village, but he was not capable of doing everything. "I passed," he said, trying to make some sort of conversation. "I know," the Sandaime chuckled softly. "You did well. Would you like to go to Ichiraku to celebrate?" His eyes lit at the perspective, but he awkwardly found himself wryly smiling back. "I don't know." The Jounin seemed keener on getting me and Sakura out of the team. Hiruzen merely nodded back slowly. "I was informed, but he did what he thought was right. There was no favoritism in play. He told me." His voice trailed off slightly, becoming a mouthed murmur that however the Sandaime did catch. The old man sighed, slowly standing up and gesturing for him to follow, as they moved nearer to the window that gave onto the sight of the entirety of Konoha. Naruto looked with perplexity at the Hokage, but followed quietly to stand next to him. "Konoha is a beautiful village," Hiruzen began, "but its people, some of them are woefully ignorant, and others had their hearts ripped apart by a great tragedy that befall us, 12 years ago." "The Kyuubi?" he asked, flicking his gaze from the Hokage to the village itself. From his spot, they all looked like ants crawling around their nests. "Yes, the Kyuubi." The Hokage's voice was laced with worry, and quite a bit of guilt. He frowned. What had the Hokage to be guilty about? The Yondaime Hokage sacrificed himself to kill the Kyuubi. That is the story that is told. The Sandaime breathed out slowly, but that is a lie. He tensed. What did that have to do with him? The Baijuyo could not be killed. It had to be sealed. The Hokage continued speaking, his voice quavering. He wasn't really going to say that, was he? It wasn't possible. He hadn't. And the only thing strong enough to hold the Kyuubi was a living being. The third Hokage turned to look at him, with his eyes slightly watery. He wished for the people to view the container of the Kyuubi, the Jinhyuriki, as a savior. He wanted people to see him as a hero, the old man added. Yet they viewed him only as the beast he contained, as the jailed and not as the jailer. That living being was a baby. Hiruzen whispered then. Me? Naruto asked, his voice choked down as he clamped a hand to his chest. I'm the Jinhyuriki? He whispered, tears streaking down his face as he shook his head. No. You have it wrong. I can't be it. Jiji, Hokage-sama, I can't be him. You heal faster than normal, Naruto. The Sandaime spoke calmly, his voice nothing more than a low whisper. And when your stomach is touched by chakra, a black seal should appear. Why me? His voice was nothing more than a barely controlled sob at that point, but he wanted an answer. Why did he have to be the one saddled with such a thing? Why him and not somebody else, somebody with a family, someone of the clan kids, anyone but him? You. The Sandaime's gaze went back to Konoha, you were the closest. Only because of that? He asked quietly. I was the closest? I was a baby, right? I was the closest to what? The door of the nursery? I was the closest to what? The window? I was in the corner among the other cribs? I was the only newborn around, taking a stroll through Konoha? What the hell was I closer to? Naruto, I'm sorry. The Sandaime answered, getting down on one knee to be on the same eye level as him. I know this is a lot to take in, but I'm fine. Naruto blurted out, shaking his head slowly. At least I know why. He muttered. Why didn't anyone tell me, if they all know? They don't all know, Naruto, Hiruzen said. The new generations were not told. Since I saw how much hatred the old one held, I passed another law to keep it a secret so that you could at least grow with friends of your age. The old man shuddered. I was wrong once more. Poisoned by subtle words, I saw you grow up alone and isolated. It's all right. Naruto turned to look at the village. I just have to show them, right? That I'm not the Kyuubi. Yes, the third Hokage replied with a small smile, you just have to show them. The blonde boy sighed, pushing his hair back with both of his hands. Did my parents, did they abandon me after I became a Jinchuriki? Oh no, no, absolutely not, they didn't. Hiruzen's voice was now filled with concern, as he consoled the boy. They loved you very much, Naruto. They died during the Kyuubi assault, but I know they would have loved you, no matter what. There's nothing left to prove it, though, he replied with a sad smile. It's fine. How about we go to Ichiraku now? Hiruzen asked, I've been hearing your stomach grumbling since you came in. I'll have a look at the orphan's check. It is supposed to come in punctually in your bank account now, since you are a shinobi of Konoha. Thanks, Jiji. He replied with a small smile, before starting to walk alongside the old man to where Ichiraku was. Meanwhile, deep beneath the bowels of the earth, Danzo Shimura was calmly reading through the report of his NE operative. At least he is no longer a yelling orange-wearing maniac. The Yami of Shinobi murmured to himself, as he looked through the masterfully written kanjis of Sai. The innovation the boy had developed to Sai's existing arsenal had been the spur of the moment, but that didn't make them any less valuable. It reminded him of another shinobi who could do the same. It reminded him of a shinobi who tweaked the summoning jutsu to become a silent thunder in the battlefield, of a man who could kill thousands with grace, elegance, and without showy displays. It reminded him of a real shinobi, one that lived his life in the shadows. What is your personal opinion on the boy, Sai? Danzo asked with a low voice, his single eye now gazing at the pale-skinned boy. He is strange. The operative admitted that openly, and by itself this should have been enough since roots were not valued for having opinions, but merely for following orders. He is a mystery. Oh. Danzo commented, why would you say that, Sai? He thought the test was more difficult on purpose because of him. He said that everyone hated him, but it doesn't make sense. The operative turned thoughtful, before adding, if he is hated, why does he wish to become a shinobi of Konoha, Danzo-sama? Naruto Uzumaki, Danzo remarked slowly, is a flight risk for Konohagakuer no Sato. Your mission is pertinent to that. You are to observe, test his loyalties and whether he is or not a true Konohagakuer shinobi. Should he be lacking, should he betray, you are ordered to execute him. Hi, Danzo-sama. Those words spoken, the operative was soon excused from the Yami of Shinobi's presence. Danzo merely turned back to his own desk, quietly reaching for a folder and flipping it open. The pictures that came out belonged to none other than the fourth Hokage, and he couldn't help but quietly murmur. If Hiruzen doesn't, then I will. The folder was then snapped shut, and placed once more within the drawer of the desk. The old Yami of Shinobi stood up and slowly walked out of his office, deep within the secret complex of Root. The white and smooth walls of the complex gave way to the rugged features of one of the hidden passageways that he used. Walking slowly, mostly because he had no desire to run, he easily reached for the sliding wall that gave into the forbidden side of the Konohagakuer library. He moved towards a particular archive, and with a quick hand sign, he broke through the seal's protection. He deftly opened the archive's uppermost drawer, removing a thick leather book from within. The title Shinobi Annals was clearly written on the front page. It was strange, yet actually reasonable, that the Academy's graduation pictures, photos, and whatnot could only be in the private archives. No ninja loved fame. The Kages were considered the leaders of their villages, their reputation extremely renowned, but in the end a successful shinobi was one who wasn't famous. Fame brought forth recognition, and recognition brought forth troubles. The fourth Hokage had been chosen mostly because he could be a good figurehead, rather than because of his power. Where there was a bright light, there had to be a deep, pitch-black, darkness. As he returned to the sliding wall, to once more re-enter route, he smiled slowly. At the same time, Naruto Uzumaki was nearing the Ichiraku's stall. Once, the name had been Ichiraku's Ramen, but that had changed to only Ichiraku's after. He shook his head. He looked warily towards the Hokage, before biting his lip. Maybe I should have gone to the bank first, Naruto spoke quietly, I could have fixed my tab then. Oh. Hiruzen brought up an eyebrow. Don't worry, this is my treat, I'll let you go afterwards, alright. Alright. Naruto breathed out, his head slightly down. The third Hokage said nothing, but he was now curious for the reason of the blonde boy's behavior. He would know soon enough, since they entered the stall a few seconds later. Ayame-san, Naruto said, walking in and taking the first free seat in the corner. The Hokage was surprised of the subdued tone of the boy. He had, of course, known that Naruto had drastically changed his behavior, but he had hoped it wouldn't have moved on to the few people who actually still cherished him. Naruto, the ramen girl smiled at the sight of the boy, huffing as she moved to one more stove. While ramen was still served within the stall, it wasn't the only food available, which was the reason why Hiruzen actually treated the blonde boy to something in the stall so early in the morning. Hokage-sama. The girl's eyes then fixed on him, making the old man chuckle as he greeted back the young woman. My, if it isn't young Ayame-chan. How are you doing? Everything's fine Hokage-sama. The girl was slightly flustered at the Hokage's use of the chan but said nothing. What can I bring you to? I'll have the milk and the bread, Ayame-san. The voice of the boy was merely a whisper, as if whatever it was that he wanted to say had been drowned. Hiruzen frowned. He had offered to buy breakfast to the blonde. He had expected him to go with ramen, for him to say no to such a salty food in the morning, and then for the both of them to have the more usual breakfast with eggs or fish or anything else. He would have even conceded the pork, just to splurge a bit. Milk and bread seemed, there was something wrong. There had to be something wrong. He was the kami of shinobi, and yet there was something he was missing. There was that nagging feeling that something was off. As the other occupants of the stall came in to eat or left, he still couldn't understand what felt different. I'll have tea. Ayame nodded as she then turned around and moved to prepare the orders. He slightly narrowed his eyes then. The girl hadn't even commented on Naruto actually passing the exam. He wouldn't say the stall woman was actually giving the boy the cold shoulder, but there wasn't the feeling of warmth he was used to see when he came in with the boy. It was then that he widened imperceptibly his eyes. Tuka was missing from the scene. He frowned. Was the other man sick? He quietly wondered on that as their orders arrived, and said nothing as he began to sip his tea calmly. His eyes went to Naruto, who was calmly eating his own breakfast. Calmly eating and Naruto had never, in his mind, mixed together. The boy seemed subdued even as he ate. There had to be something going on, but he was a shinobi, not a barbarian, he'd tactfully ask afterwards. Naruto. The voice of Sakura Haruno broke through the uncomfortable silence that had stretched for far too long in their side of the stall. He was surprised then by how fast the boy could finish eating his food, before swinging around and standing back up. Have to go. He muttered quickly, before dashing out. This too was extremely suspicious. I'm picking up his tab. The Sandaime commented, how much does he owe you? Ayame looked at him with a perplexed face, before it slowly became grim as if she had just then swallowed a toad. Nothing, the girl whispered, he's always paying, even when I offer him the meal on the house. I think he leaves the ryos on the counter even when he doesn't order food. I found a few stacked notes every now and then. Why would he do that? Hiruzen asked, perplexed at such a behavior. I think he feels guilty, Hokage-sama. Ayame replied in a low voice. The girl shook her head slowly, before grabbing the plate and moving to the sink to clean it. Hiruzen said nothing, as his eyes scanned the now empty spot where Naruto had been earlier, and then back to the tense shoulders of Ayame. He brought up an eyebrow as he finally settled his gaze on a corner of the room he hadn't bothered to look in. Once, Tuki had told him he had placed the frame of Ayam's mother in the corner because she would have enjoyed watching them cook even from heaven. Now, next to the frame of Ayam's mother there was another one. That of her father. Naruto was walking quickly down the road, following Sakura who had been looking for him everywhere. "Sensei is waiting for us in training ground 13. I didn't know where you lived, so I went over to Ichiraku's. Seems I was lucky." The girl's voice was laced with self-importance, as if she was explaining her reasoning to him and was expecting praise. He was in a bad mood, his stomach making knots and his hands sweating slightly. He was probably a masochist. He shouldn't have gone to Ichiraku's, he shouldn't even ask other people if they wanted to go there, but he had a debt to pay after all. He always would. "Yeah," he replied in a whisper. The pink-haired girl didn't look downcast at his soft-spoken tones, because the next moment she began to talk. He didn't know what to say, and so he remained silent as the girl expressed her belief that eating ramen in the morning was bad, that she thought she had seen the Hokage standing next to him for a moment and many other normal things for normal 12 years old. He was the Jinhiriki of the Kyuubi, and here he was listening to how the girl's long hair was because she had heard by a trustworthy source of course how Sasuke loved long hair. He didn't know whether to point out that the shinobi manual advised against complicated hair patterns and long hair or not, because it was easier to pull on the long hair of a female than not. Then again, he wasn't going to start a fashion war on long or short hair. Training ground 13 was nothing more than a grassy plain with a few sparse shrubberies. A single big tree stood in the center of it, casting a big shadow over their sensei, the man's back against the trunk. Sai was sitting a few meters away, painting on his scroll with his ink brush. "Sensei! I found him!" Sakura's exclamation rang through the training ground, as the girl waved her arm to attract the attention of their teacher. Aoba-sensei did see them, since he pushed himself off the side of the tree and then calmly walked over them, Sai putting away his scroll and getting on their side. "Well then," the Jounin began, "we can now begin our introductions as Team 13. The sunglass-wearing man smiled slightly, before starting. "My name is Aoba Yamashiro and, just as planned, I have decided to train you all into Chiryunins and then, hopefully, see you achieve Jounin rank before I die of old age. I like graded Yam and Yama-ima. I dislike improvising and randomness. I work for the torture and interrogation department of Konohagakure, and am a Jounin sensei as of this year. I held the title of Takubutsu Jounin previously. My dream for the future is to get you all promoted, just as planned. Your turn, Sai. My name is Sai Sato. I like to draw beautiful things. I dislike having to see ugly and dickless things. I enjoy Shan-Naro." Sakura's fist drove Sai into the ground, as the pink-haired girl began to yell. "You damn punk! What the hell is your kami-be-damned problem? I'm going to Harano-san." Aoba's curt surname calling held the desired effect, as Sakura looked bashfully away from the scene of her carnage. Naruto hadn't of course stopped the girl. If Sai wanted to dig his own tomb, he was free to go at it as he wished. "Your turn." Sakura nodded, and then blissfully gazing in the horizon began. "My name is Sakura Harano. I like." She giggled with a faraway glance, "and I dislike, Sai, to begin with, an Ino pig and Ami stupid. My dream is to." She giggled again, a slight dribble of blood falling down her nose. Naruto saw their Jounin sensei sigh in frustration, before turning to look at him. "Naruto." He gulped down nervously. "My name is Naruto Uzumaki," he began, his eyes looking now down on the ground. "I am the jailer of the Kyuubi Jinhiriki. Konoha hates me and I'm nearly dead last. I'd like to have friends. I like silence," he said then, "and homemade ramen. I dislike the time it takes to prepare the ramen, or when it burns or turns out raw. I dislike being stared at, or people whispering behind my back. My dream." He closed his eyes. "My dream is." Revenge wasn't the answer. He hated the glares, the whispers, the pettiness of some people, but he couldn't hate all of Konoha. Some people had been kind to him, people like Tuki and Ayam. The third Hokage too had helped him a great deal. Yet he couldn't help but feel that, becoming Hokage, was no longer his dream. He didn't want, nor he believed he could, become Hokage at all. He'd have more luck with a dream like, become the new boogeyman of the world, or, destroy IWA blind and barehanded. He just didn't want to remain alone. Was it that difficult? He wistfully used to imagine himself playing games with equally loud children once, but now he would have been fine even without the noise. He would have been fine with barely a friend or two, good friends, to talk to over a cup of tea. My dream is, to make friends. He said out loud, and to keep them no matter what. Who was he kidding? People would run from him the moment he told them the truth. The Kyuubi in him would make sure of that. It was enough he could actually walk through the streets. He wondered if anyone had ever tried to kill him because of the beast he held. Maybe they had done so in the orphanage? Maybe that was the reason the Hokage had displaced him into one of the one-room apartments. What if he hadn't wished to become a shinobi? Would he have been left to lead a normal civilian life with a monster in his guts? He needed to know more, but how? The librarian didn't like him at all. As he was so lost in thoughts, he hadn't realized the slightly glazed look that had fallen on Sakura's emerald eyes, or the worrisome one on Aoba-sensei. Furthermore, he had also completely missed the curiosity etched on Sai's face, the first true display of emotion the boy had ever shown till then. "I can be your friend." Sakura blurted that out pretty quickly. Clasping both of her hands on his right one, she smiled. "We can be friends, right?" Right," he replied, uneasy at such a display of forwardness. The girl's eyes were shining with determination by then, as if a fire had been lit in her. "All right. Let's all be friends." With a quick lounging motion, Sakura grappled Sai with her other arm, pulling him against her and smiling as their cheeks collided one with the other. In that moment, just as Sakura was pulling the victory sign, a flash of a camera came by. Naruto snapped his eyes shut a moment later, half wobbling out of the crushing hug just as he heard their sensei speak. "Well done, just as planned." The moment he opened his eyes again, he blearily cast a sour look at the Jounin, who was now standing behind the three of them while a photographer stood instead in front, having taken the picture. "I'll have the negatives developed in a second," the photographer remarked within a split second, grasping from a tubular pocket in his flak jacket 3 white papers. He stacked them together beneath the photo that had come out from one of those old cameras that published the film in a second. The next instant, a small swirl of chakra poured from the photo downwards, and when it was done, the photo shinobi deftly framed all 4 pictures before handing them out. Their sensei hummed his approval at how the photos had come out, while he was actually slightly embarrassed. He and Sai both looked as if they had been about to fall against Sakura, who had both arms surrounding their necks and her hands were showing the victory sign, her eyes displaying her happiness. Sai was actually with his eyes open in shock, one of his hands tightly holding onto the scroll he had been painting on earlier. He on the other hand had his eyes nearly bulged over, but a small smile graced his lips as he was pulled in the team hug. Behind them, putting his index and middle finger to hold his glasses on, Aoba-sensei seemed to be enacting some sort of cool pose while holding a whirling kunao in his hand in a bright and flashing smile. It actually did look like a pretty team picture. He wouldn't admit it, but this. He could live with this. Author's notes. I had to end this with the positive note. I mean, I always end my chapters with angst every now and then, or horrible cliffhangers, but this seemed just like the perfect end of this chapter. Isn't it heartwarming at the end? I mean, come on. Didn't your heart melt just a little? Think of how much fun they'll have, fighting, living as friends, and then of course having characters' deaths send the others on a psychopathic path of mayhem and destruction. I'm joking. Of course I am joking. That said, onto the probable complaints. Sakura plus Naruto pairing equals I am not sure. I am never sure of a pairing until the nearly last chapters. If there's a fixed pairing I actually stop writing it. I do not enjoy those stories that put the pairing immediately and then have the characters forced together. Naru-ino equals they meet. They meet again. They talk to one another. They meet once more. They meet even more and fall in love because they were meant for one another. Especially if there are pieces like, she had never known how hot he looked. Or similar. With me, you'll have to read the story and hope the things I place in the small bit of writing called plot doesn't kill off any of your hopeful girlfriends. It can happen. It might happen. Another thing is the following chapters. Now, I don't want to scare anyone off, but I recently read something really interesting. Notice sarcasm, I enjoy using it. Shinobi do missions. Naruto shows a few. I mean, the wave arc was only one mission. One mission before the Chunin exams, but, I mean, they're not shinobi missions. Genins are little more than pack mules and fixers and hired help. Chunins are instead guards, office workers, patrols. The difference in the D ranks and C ranks is enormous. A B rank is even more and an A rank is far off the charts. So do not expect the wave arc to be as you think it will be. Heck, don't expect anything and leave happily. I am not saying OC Fest however. I am just saying be prepared to see canon characters elsewhere, doing, smart stuff, you know? The things shinobi should be doing. So Naruto is going to be infiltration / spec ops / ultra awesome shinobi of Doom TM. I don't have the slightest clue yet. And if the author says that, one should fear the might of casual randomness, I write where the characters bring me, and what they decide is the path they take. I just write about them, and how they would act depending on what is different. You killed Tookie, you lurid bloodthirsty assassin of ramen goodness, may Kern have your soul you. Alright. Naruto is introverted for a reason that was hinted and that is now out in the open. He believes himself responsible for Tookie's death. Meaning that without Tookie, it's only a yam at the stall. Such a small thing, the death of a stall vendor. Such a great impact. Chapter 4, the first mission is a revelation. The dog waggled its tail as it waited for him to throw the small bouncing ball. The ball was a bright red color, and squeaked with a small sharp whistle every time it was squeezed. He gripped it lightly, before delicately throwing it near the animal. The dog barked, before grabbing the ball with its mouth and biting it repeatedly. A few seconds later, it dropped the ball at his feet again and Naruto grabbed it again. Dog sitting, that was their first D-rank mission. D-ranks were the vast majority of missions a village publicized, going as far as having even announcement boards giving the civilians a chance to read of the current prices to hire the ninjas. You wanted a fence painted? You paid 50 ryos. You wanted the dogs brought out for an entire evening? That was 75 ryos. You wanted someone to buy the groceries for you, as fast as possible? That was the money for the expense and 100 ryos. Shinobi could cut the lines at the market and the stalls after all being a member of the military had its boons and privileges and they could take to the rooftops. Naruto's eyes went to his two other teammates. Sakura was somehow holding her ground against a giant husky who wanted to climb a tree, while Sai was instead calmly painting what looked like a half-dumb corgi breed that lazily took the sun. He had a basset hound. The dog actually flopped on his side, waiting to be petted as it looked at him with its perpetually sad-looking face. It barked once, to attract his attention, and then went to peacefully lay there, its eyes fixed on the ball in his free hand. Aoba-sensei was scribbling on a scroll, his sunglasses every now and then falling down to the tip of his nose, as the man was standing upside down on a branch in pure bat-like fashion. Naruto wondered why the jounin had to be in that position, but he didn't dare ask. The day was sunny, bright, and warm, and all in all it seemed like the perfect example of what a summer vacation looked like. Dog sitting wasn't much of a chore, the dogs were usually just a bit mischievous, and the only yucky thing was the need to use a plastic bag to collect their excrements if they did any. The rest of the job was pure and unaltered bliss. The dog didn't judge him, or bark at him angrily, or stare at him angrily. It didn't talk and it certainly didn't seem to be angry at him, differently from his owner of course. Maybe he could buy a dog, but the thought was soon squashed away. Who would sell him one? And even if he got a stray, he didn't count on the poor creature to last much before getting poisoned by casually forgotten rat traps. Maybe he was just overthinking. It wasn't as if the villagers really wanted to make his life miserable, or went out of their way to do so, but could he risk it? The answer was simple, no. He couldn't. Gather them. We're on schedule. Their sensei suddenly said, dropping down from his branch and landing softly on his feet. Naruto merely grabbed the leash, before gently standing up and pulling the dog along. Sakura yanked hard, earning a loud yelp from her dog. "Oh damn it!" she exclaimed. "Naruto, can you help me?" He raised an eyebrow at that. The girl had chosen the husky because he looked like the least vivacious of the lot. He shrugged and offered his leash to her. The girl smiled as they exchanged them, and the next moment the husky simply fell in line next to him. The dog panted hard, his big tongue out as it breathed and wetted his nose. "Woof!" it gutturally barked, before following him keenly on his side. "How did you do that?" Sakura exclaimed, just as the basset hound suddenly found its energies and began to run and bark his way forward. "Ai!" The pink-haired girl was pulled along, as they reconvened near their Jounin-sensei, who was actually twitching his lips upwards at such a display. "Let's bring them back to their owner," Aoba commented, "then we can head over to the training ground." "Yes, sensei!" Sakura eagerly exclaimed. "Are we going to learn something cool?" the girl happily asked as they began to walk on the street. "Something that, you know, is powerful." "Well, you'll see," the Jounin retorted. "Having a cool and powerful move means nothing, ugly." Sai's reply was answered with a fist on the side of his face that sent the pale boy flying in the air, before he crashed against the wall of the nearby building. Picking himself up, thankfully with the animal still intact and in one piece, the raven-haired boy returned to the group. "Harano-san," Aoba remarked curtly, once more chastising with a single word the pink-haired girl. "Must I really keep on recalling you like this? You are a kunoichi of Konoha. It is unacceptable for you to manhandle in such a way a comrade." Sakura looked down on the ground, her right foot tracing a line as she looked abashed. "And you, Sai," their Jounin-sensei added then, "must you really antagonize your teammates? If you have to nickname someone, you should use something positive, rather than something negative." "I understand, sensei," the boy replied. His eyes moved up and down Sakura, as if he was analyzing her. The girl looked disquieted, as her teammate seemed to search for a redeeming feature. She was actually looking nervous, as the boy finally spoke. Plank. A nervous tick mark appeared on Sakura's head at that word. "What do you mean with that?" Sakura asked the question with a sweet tone, underlying a world of pain if the boy answered wrongly. Sai, unheeding the clear signs to shut up, answered promptly. "You look sturdy with the thick legs and the flat chest. Shan narrow." This time Sai was pummeled to the ground, leaving behind a small crater as Sakura calmed down only in the end. For once Aoba didn't say a word on that, but the man did cough to get back their attention. Sai remained a twitching heap of broken bones for a few more seconds, before wobbling back on his feet. "Ma." "Don't say it," Naruto said, casting him a pleading look. "Just call her Sakura." Sai actually brought his head to the side, casting him a questioning glance, before nodding to him. "Sakura," Sai began, and showing a slight surprise when the girl turned around with a frown on her face. "What?" "Sakura." The pale-skinned boy repeated the girl's name calmly. "I see, it is a redeeming quality." The boy nodded once more. Whatever." The kunoichi shrugged and moved next to their sensei, leaving behind the other two. Naruto raised a quizzical eyebrow, as he waited for Sai to explain his sentence. The other boy actually caught on and pointed out quickly. "The cherry plant, she does have pink hair." Naruto blinked. "Oh, right." Sai said nothing, and their arrival to the owner of the dogs passed by without incident. It was as they were delivering the dogs that the man, a gruff-looking guy in his 40s, gave a slight peek under the husky's collar and frowned. "My poor Bernard has welts." "Welts? Do you find it funny, boy, to tug on the leash hard, huh?" The man snapped towards Naruto, as the boy widened his eyes in surprise. Since he didn't answer, the man continued. "I'm not going to pay someone who badly handles my dogs. The Hokage will hear about this. My poor Bernard, look how much in pain he is." The husky was actually pretty much lazing around in the doorway now, not at all showing his pain. "Sir, your dog seems," Aoba tried, but was silenced by the angry words of the man. "No. He's in pain, badly handled by that demon, that's what it is all about. Wait here." He quickly entered his home, returning with the scroll that was meant to be compiled and then delivered once the mission was completed, to show the customer's satisfaction. Here. The man literally threw it at the Jounin sensei. I just knew I couldn't trust the foul creature. Then the door slammed shut hard, leaving the Jounin to blink with an unexpressive face. Sakura's mouth was slightly open in shock, while Sai seemed as emotionless as ever. Naruto on the other hand. Really, what was he expecting? His eyes looked down on the ground, as he quickly scrubbed his eyes because they itched. He took a small breath, before trying to interest himself on the nearby wall. Naruto, Sakura began hesitantly, but he shuddered, thinking at whatever next her words would be. He was saved from answering by their sensei, who quickly snapped. Well, let's get going then. Marching quickly, the Jounin began to head towards the tower, and Naruto grasped onto that like a drowning man grasps a floating barrel. He quickly began to follow the man, silently. Behind them, Sakura frowned hard, before looking perplexedly to where Sai had been, and then to where the door of their client was. She had handled the husky. She knew she might have been hard in her tugging, but she was pretty sure there hadn't been any blood on the collar, or anything even remotely similar to welts on the neck of the big dog. Even if there were, it wouldn't have been Naruto's fault, but hers. She memorized the number of the house, planning to return there later and apologize, maybe offering a cream for welts. Sakura quickly ran behind the rest of the group, her eyes now settled on Naruto's back. She was puzzled. The man had been outright furious, but to call Naruto those mean words was something that perplexed her. The boy was soft-spoken and mostly silent, and he didn't seem at all like a demon. Wearing his usual clothes, with his hair slowly growing out to the sides, he didn't even seem menacing. She could make a scarier face than Naruto's, and the whisker marks. They made him look more like a kitten than some sort of dangerous beast. Sai, for all his emotionless face, was probably creepier and scarier than the blonde boy. She shook her head. She would ask Naruto afterwards. Maybe proposing an Ichiraku's team lunch? She could certainly do that, couldn't she? Sure, she was dieting and all for Sasuke's sake, but a bit of a splurge on something light wouldn't be bad. She had heard of a new type of diet soup, and she had been curious about trying it out. It seemed like the perfect solution. Sai, meanwhile, was feeling something strange. Root taught that reports should always be written sincerely, giving an objective view of events and making sure all details were included. The civilian had delivered his scroll after a few seconds. Unless he had already prepared one, there just was no way he could have written an accurate reporting of how they had treated the man's dogs. To add to the general puzzlement was the fact that the man hadn't even listened to the end of their mission report. Even on a failed mission, the operatives left time for the surviving shinobi to report, before drawing conclusions on new training schedules. He didn't know what to make of the situation, but he did memorize the name of the street and the number of the house. Maybe he'd pay a visit later, just to check if perhaps the man was a shinobi who could write really fast, or had a sort of plot to hinder the genin teams by delivering false status of satisfaction. He probably would have to cut the wires on the house lightning, break a few pipes to make sure there could be a distraction, and then probably smash a couple of windows to give the fault to vandals. He, of course, would be doing this purely for testing purposes. The fact he felt that the way Naruto had been treated to be unjust was completely not something of concern for him. Really, he was there only to observe. He wouldn't act on feelings. As they reached the Hokage's tower, Naruto quietly kept to his silence, even after delivering the scroll to the mission office. The shinobi in charge opened the scroll and read it, before frowning slightly and displaying an awry face. He delivered the scroll to the shinobi next to him, who did the same thing before passing it to the Hokage, who brought up an eyebrow and looked towards the group. Naruto flinched, but said nothing as his gaze was kept down. Sakura was puzzled, especially when the Hokage's gaze went to their teacher, who slightly shook his head. The Hokage made a small smile and imperceptibly nodded. The old shinobi then nodded a bit wider to the Jounin to his side, and the two acknowledged it with their respective nods. Very well. The mission was completed successfully. You will all receive the full pay that is due. The amount will be sent to your bank accounts. The Hokage puffed on his pipe, before adding. Dismissed. Hokage-sama. Aoba answered back, before turning to leave. The rest of the group followed outside, and as they left the tower their sensei began to talk. Very well. This is our first successful mission, our first D rank and of course the first earned money of you three, we should thus celebrate this. Where do you want to eat? I'm offering, of course. Their sensei added the last part quickly, looking at them with a small smile. We could go to Ichiraku's, sensei. Sakura remarked earnestly, looking towards Naruto's face who was now giving her a curious glance. She just smiled back at him, it wasn't as if this was a big sacrifice on her part. The fact that the blonde boy only nodded meekly however made her even more curious on the enigma that was Naruto Uzumaki. Hadn't he insisted the day before on going there? Why was he now so reserved? It is fine with me, sensei. Sai answered last and with a nod. The Jounin sensei shrugged, and began to walk towards the stall, with all the genins in tow. Naruto, Sakura began, I'm sorry. He looked at her with perplexity. Surely he understood why she was saying she was sorry? I'm going to speak with our client this afternoon, after training. I'll tell him I was the one in charge of the husky for the entire afternoon, and... Don't. Naruto blurted that out quickly. There's no need. He added slowly. He already yelled at me, there's no need to have him yell at you too, I'm fine. But it's not fair, she retorted. It doesn't matter, drop it. He answered curtly, before wincing slightly and turning his gaze sideways. Sakura frowned, but said nothing more. What did the boy have to hide? Maybe the welts had really been there, but she hadn't seen Naruto pull on the leash that hard, and certainly not as hard as her. The moment they reached Ichiraku's, the silence that had fallen on the group was starting to suffocate her. I'm going to take the diet noodle soup, what about you other? Sakura asked earnestly, trying to make conversation as they sat down at the end of the stall. Naruto stood in the corner, while their sensei stood on the other side with Sai to his right. The pink-haired girl was instead between Sai and Naruto, having already split her chopsticks and beginning to hum and wait. I will have momen tofu noodles, Sai commented. I'll take the miso ramen, their sensei remarked calmly. In the quiet silence that followed, Sakura sported a tick mark on her forehead as she slowly turned to Naruto. The boy was carefully looking through the menu, and with the look of concentration that he held the girl couldn't bring herself to snap at him. His gaze was soft as it scanned through the small one-page slip of paper. Finally he gave a small breath, before replying slowly. I'll have the pork ramen. The way he said it was as if he was fighting a battle against himself. There really was something strange with the boy, but she knew better than to press him on it. She'd just wait, they knew each other only since a couple of days, there was no reason to be nosy about it. She wondered how Ami and Ino were doing with their teammates. The Ami stupid bitch imbecile was probably funning around Sasuke-kun with her uncouthness and her horrendous flirty manners. Maybe she was even hugging him, or Kami forbid kissing him. That wouldn't stand, she'd show her who was meant to melt Sasuke's heart. At the same time, Naruto was instead quietly waiting for his order. He grimaced slightly as he split his chopsticks. The pork ramen had always been his favorite. He used to take it with extra pork, but since Tookie had died, he ordered it less and less. The flavor too was different now. Maybe it was just his imagination, but he suspected that Ayam was trying to experiment to get back the taste of the old ramen of her father. It probably involved lemons or almonds, sometimes even sweet. He grimaced as his order arrived and he began to eat it quietly. This time it tasted like something spicy as it went down his throat, but he kept quiet and ate. This was just another part of his debt, another part of his punishment. Maybe Ayam was doing it on purpose, spicing his food, or giving it strange tastes. It didn't matter. He had a debt to repay and he would repay it, even if it meant eating badly. Can I taste it? The voice startled him, and as he looked to the side he realized Sakura had been the one speaking. Her own soup was half eaten, and she was eyeing his ramen with a look more of curiosity than hunger. His brain couldn't compute, so it came out with the reasonable answer he could give. No. He then quickly scarfed it down as the girl berated him. Hey. It was an honest question. Sheesh. Sakura harumphed, crossing her arms over her chest as she looked at him with distaste. He said nothing as he cleaned the plate. You ordered the diet soup, he pointed out. Next time, don't. Naruto merely sighed. He simply didn't want the girl to realize the taste was slightly off. It wouldn't do well for the business. He coughed slightly, as the spiciness soon passed through his throat and cleared out. He weakly smiled back to Ayam, who was looking at him with a slightly perplexed gaze. Once lunch was done, the group left the stall and headed towards their training ground, Naruto staying quietly in the back, his gaze downwards. Really, how rude can you be? Sakura muttered between herself, as she gave another eyeful to the blonde boy. She hadn't expected him to be that rude on food, maybe he was just a glutton? He had eaten awfully fast after all. Still, she couldn't compare that to the kindness of just a few moments earlier. It wasn't as if he had been the one to pay for the food, so stinginess wasn't the problem. Training ground 13 was quiet as always as they reached it. Aoba-sensei flexed his muscles and loosened his shoulders, before turning around to stare at his genins. Now, there is an important lesson to learn before we can begin training. I want you all to listen to me carefully, understood? The three students nodded, their eyes staring straight ahead at the jounin. A shinobi is a prepared force, the man spoke calmly. Improvising on the battlefield is good and well, but it is the sign of a poor ninja. Shinobi, no matter their rank, must prepare carefully for their missions. We are a hidden force, who work for money and thus might be tasked one day with retrieval of hostages, and the next day with kidnappings. We might be asked to kill or to protect, to guard, or to demolish. We might be asked to infiltrate or to counterspy. Shinobi must thus be prepared for any occasion and chance. If you are not prepared, then you fail as a ninja. The wind gently picked up, a cool breeze passing through Sakura's long hair as she listened inattentively to the jounin's words. Naruto remained quiet, his face grim but determined, while Sai kept his facade schooled into a perfect lack of emotions. A shinobi's work is done quickly and flawlessly, Aoba added. If you are tasked with retrieving a hostage, then you must do so as fast as possible and without committing mistakes. This brings us to the shinobi rule that a mission must always be completed. If you have to blow up a heavily guarded bridge, suicide bombing is a solution you must envisage. Sakura gulped anxiously. A shinobi is a member of the military. You may be called at all hours of the day and of the night to assist in missions, and should war begin you will be deployed. The corps cannot be left until life-threatening injuries or old age. You are hereby a member of Konohagaku no Sado's shinobi force, and from this moment onwards you will remain as such until death. You may not transfer into another country, you may not refuse the Hokage's orders, and you may not leave your assigned positions. You will obey your commander, always. 3 hesitant nods came from the genins, and Aoba sighed. A genin is the name to define lower nins, those not tasked with important secrets or techniques. As genins, you will be outfitted with the basic tools of the trade, and unless you possess a clan, and a member of said clan who might impart onto you his or her skills, you will not learn any more jutsus until you make Chiryunin. Aoba took a small breath. This isn't to say there is nothing I can teach you, the basics are an important part of the shinobi world, and those who master them will always have an easier time than the rest. The proper usage of tools is also something you will learn from me, as well as engagement tactics and the means to achieve your missions. The real training, both in elemental affinity and advanced techniques, starts once you reach the rank of Chiryunin. Doesn't that mean clan children are advantaged? Sakura asked with a slight frown. Yes, but also no, Aoba replied. Clans tend to develop specific techniques, in which they certainly excel. Hyagas are an example of short-range combat, while the Yamanaka's mind techniques are optimal for interrogation use. Yet outside of their area they are extremely limited in options. The Hyaga's eye can see everywhere around them, but if the opponent does not close in, it consumes chakra needlessly. But they have more options than we do. They can learn techniques and they ignore others. Aoba shook his head slowly, before taking out from within his jacket a scroll. You all will learn Kenjutsu. You all will learn Shurikenjutsu. You all will learn Taijutsu, Genjutsu countering, and Ninjutsu theory. You will learn how to control and refine your chakra, and how to use it in shinobi situations. You will learn how to properly care for your tools and how to properly treat wounds. Maybe you will not learn how to enter the mind of an opponent, but you will learn how to torture one. Aoba smiled slightly. I do work for the torture and interrogation department, after all. Aoba looked at his genins then, evaluating their reactions to his words. Naruto winced slightly, probably understanding the seriousness of the situation, but remained quiet. Sakura seemed appeased, probably reiterating mentally her desire to grab Sasuke-kun, and sporting now a smile on her face. Sai was puzzling him. The Jounin knew something was wrong with the pale-skinned boy. For one thing, he was too much composed and collected. His features were schooled as if he had received extensive training in controlling his emotions, and the lack of tone in his words was making him think he was actually ignorant, when saying ugly as a nickname and considering it endearing. The third Hokage had told him the boy was a root failure, but he wondered to himself what precisely that meant. He'd find out soon enough. First of all, a shinobi must possess equal parts of earth and heaven. Today I will spar with each of you and see where you stand with earth, which means the body. The Jounin took then a loose stance, as if this was nothing but routine. Come at me without overly thinking. Sakura, you're first. As the pink-haired girl nodded, taking on the stocky basic stance the academy taught, Naruto watched with a horrible grimace as the girl was unable to land even a single hit on the man. Not that her form was bad, it was actually perfect textbook form, or that she wasn't trying, but the difference in skill was something clear. Sai went next, and the boy actually showed a sort of remarkable attitude in throwing punches, kicks, and closing in as much as possible, as if nearly pressing oneself against the opponent was an agreeable tactic. Their sensei said nothing during the spar, albeit that with Sai lasted a bit more before the boy winded down. Finally, it was his turn. He settled into the stance, and began to fling his own punches and kicks. Aoba looked at him with a frown, and what seemed like the start of a distasteful look. His arms began to tremble, as he shuddered, hoping there wouldn't be a glare soon enough. Thankfully, his own practice lasted far less than that of Sakura. All right. Aoba sighed, shaking his head slowly. Sai, you're fine. Sakura, you should be less tense and more fluid in your movements. The Jounin's gaze then went to Naruto. Naruto, yours is horrible. I think you should simply forget about entering a taijutsu match for the moment. I'm sorry, but it's too time-consuming to get you ingrained or back on par with the others. You just can't develop muscle memory overnight, and unluckily there are 3 of you and 1 of me. I can't waste time on breaking your bad habits and not training your other 2 teammates. Naruto opened his mouth, probably to say something back, to try and give an excuse for his pitiful stances, but then he just closed it and made a grim smile as he nodded. Very well, during the time I'll be training your teammates in taijutsu, I'll have you started on shurikenjutsu. Aoba remarked, fair's fair, I can't have you killed either once we start taking missions outside of the village, and as it is it's far better if we simply let your taijutsu drop until you reach Chiryunin, where the more advanced styles are available. The Jounin shrugged. This isn't to say you can't try and learn by yourself, but your bad habits are probably ingrained since the time of the academy. Didn't anyone ever correct you on your mistakes? No, nobody had. The teachers had never taught wrongly, since after all the classes were holding far too many students for the sensei to wish them all misfortune, but that didn't mean they couldn't simply ignore his mistakes and let him go. That was probably the only reason there was he was incapable at taijutsu. Not because he had been trained badly or wrongly, but because he hadn't been corrected at all. He shrugged it off, averting his gaze as he felt the burns of embarrassment run through his body. What was he standing there taking the heat for? So he sucked at taijutsu, all right. Did he have to say it in front of his teammates too? I'll take that silence as a no, Aoba said. Let me guess, you're now thinking I'm humiliating you in front of your teammates for no reason, right? Naruto looked up, staring in surprise at Aoba, who simply chuckled back, albeit the chuckle was dry, and not at all showing humor. It's wrong. I am not humiliating you for starters, just telling the truth. And there is a reason I'm telling your shortcomings to your teammates, because they too will have theirs. I already know Sakura's stamina is extremely pitiful, and Sai's lack of initiative might be a problem. There might be much more I have yet to see, but the point is that teammates should know one another's weaknesses and shortcomings to be able to cover for them. There always is someone lacking in taijutsu, or with low chakra, or without stamina in a peer group. The important thing is not to hide it, so that the team might be able to help if the need arise. For example, Aoba coughed slightly. If an enemy shinobi were to attack you in close quarters, both Sakura and Sai would know you'd go down fast unless one of them decided to come and help you. Out of the two, Sai would be the one who should come, but if Sai is in a pinch, then it's Sakura who has to enter the fray. This is a split-second decision on the battlefield, something that however must be planned as a contingency months earlier. Aoba nodded to himself as he spoke, smiling as he saw the looks of understanding coming from the genins. This is what is important. Acknowledging one's own strengths and weaknesses. Having the correct seishin, the correct heart, is the first rule of the shinobi. Without it, you will not possess the maturity required for the work you will have to do. Remember this, and just as planned you will become Chiryunins and Jounins. The Jounin took a deep breath then, closing his eyes as he smirked slightly. He had truly given a wonderful speech, the product of careful deliberation and planning. He knew he had conquered the hearts of his students now, there was simply no way they would remain unfazed by what he had told them. Now he would train them into the perfect students, hopefully keeping them alive until they reached Jounin rank. There were no wars out in the open, thus he actually had the chance to get his entire team to survive, at least until the first Chiryunin exams. Not that he'd let them participate in those in Konoha, it would be too soon, and he truly doubted they'd be able to get past the first test, whatever it was going to be. Sensei? Sakura asked, as Aoba opened his eyes then keeping his smile on the face. Can we go now? Why yes, of course. Tomorrow morning, 7 o'clock, in front of the Hokage Tower. Aoba stammered, as he realized that while his genins did look thoughtful, they weren't looking at him as a source of inspiration. He'd have more inspiring dialogues to plan and script then. How could he become one of the most recognized Jounin instructors if he didn't? Only because Ebisu had gotten his hands on training the nephew of the Hokage, the next issue of Shinobi Monthly would have him as the perfect instructor. Sakura waved goodbye to both Sai and Naruto, before heading off towards their client's house. She would clear the misunderstanding, whether Naruto wanted the apologies or not it didn't matter, what was right was right. She smiled to herself as she knocked on the door of the civilian in question, and patiently she began to wait. A few minutes later, the door creaked open to reveal the gruff man, who looked at her with a perplexed gaze. Well? What do you want? The man asked curtly. I'm sorry sir, I just wanted to apologize for. There's no need. The man quickly said, cutting her off, it's not your fault you've been saddled with the demon as a teammate. The civilian sighed, before shaking his head. I can't tell you anything about it, secret shinobi stuff and all, but you should watch out for him. He's bad, really bad. He's got evil inside you know? He might look human, but he isn't. The man shook his head. He took my wife, that he did, 12 years ago. Sakura's eyes bugged wide open. Naruto killed the man's wife? How? No, that didn't make sense. The boy had to have been what, 1 year old? She didn't even know when he had been born to begin with. Can't tell you anything, girl. Law is the law. The civilian added, nodding to himself. 10 of October, my wife's death that is. Wicked evil inside that boy, let me tell you. Sakura's eyes widened as she realized just what the 10th of October was about. But that's the day of the Kyuubi's attack. Sakura's murmur was barely audible, but the wicked smile on the man's face told her she had hit the nail on the head. Something wicked was inside Naruto, something that had killed the man's wife, the same day of the Kyuubi's attack on Konoha. That's your opinion, the civilian nodded thoughtfully, but the rest of the village knows and cannot tell. I didn't tell you anything after all. Careful now, wouldn't want to break an S-rank secret. And then the door closed, leaving a pale and still Sakura in the porch of the house. The kunoichi wobbled back on the street, her eyes blinking. Naruto was the Kyuubi. No, Naruto had the Kyuubi within him. Naruto held the demon that had nearly destroyed Konoha within his stomach. She clenched her hands. This was a secret she wasn't meant to know. An S-rank secret meant death on revelation. She had to keep quiet about it, but how was that possible? She had to hit the library, she had to find out if Naruto was dangerous or not. Still, it explained why the man had mistreated Naruto that badly. Had she lost her parents to the Kyuubi, maybe she would have hated Naruto too. Not knowing what to think, she missed the narrow eyes of Sai, who was standing quietly on the second floor of the civilian's house. Having entered the home of the man earlier, he had proceeded to cast a mild genjutsu on the man, making sure he would say precisely what he wanted him to. He couldn't risk Sakura breaking in the middle of a mission if Naruto decided to reveal that bit of information on him during the trip. If the girl, after saying she wanted to be his friend, renounced him just the following day, it would be the perfect test on whether the Jinhuriki was a failure as a shinobi or not. He was a failure because he still felt some twinge of emotion, and for Danzo-sama that was a horrible trait for a shinobi. Naruto was a failure for different reasons, but one thing the boy had to possess: mental fortitude. Jinhyurikis had to be psychologically sane, or they were nothing more than dangers for their own villages. There just wasn't another choice. Still, Sai shrugged and then unsheathed his tanto. The civilian had just revealed enough for it to warrant the breaking of the S-rank secret. And the punishment for that was death. Chapter 5, The second mission is shocking. Naruto flinched as the sparks nearly singed his gloves. The broken electrical cable dangled near him, but the power had been cut off for them to work on it. The job wasn't dangerous or difficult, but it did contain a slight amount of risk with all the static electricity that lingered in the air. His hair had all frizzed up, just like Sakura's. Sai's shortcut had saved him from the embarrassment, but that didn't mean sparks weren't flying out of their bodies whenever they touched something. The transformer was in a corner of the room, filled with cables and piles of batteries. Some of them had leaks, and that meant they had to remove and put them aside, grab new ones and substitute them. Once that was done, and after checking for broken or damaged cables, they would relight the entire thing and be done with it. Naruto half-heartedly hissed as a shock passed through his gloves and reached his hand, making him wince and remove the limb from the cable. Hadn't they discharged the damn things? He watched as Sakura fatigued in bringing one of the giant batteries towards the transformer, and bit his lip. He moved closer to her and, after a brief indecisive moment, said, "Hey, Seika." The girl leaped, letting go of the battery as she took half a step backwards. He quickly grabbed the battery before it could fall, and then looked at her with perplexity. What is it, Naruto? Want to go and grab the new cables? I can take care of the batteries too." His voice trailed off as he watched the fearful look of Sakura averting his gaze. He felt sick. Did the girl know? When had she been told? Who had told her? Why? He didn't want to think about that, so he simply grabbed the battery and moved it to its socket within the transformer, before returning to weeding out the rusty or broken cables. He eyed Sakura then, and tensed as the girl began to move, sort of mechanically, towards the other corner of the room. She passed near Sai, and he tensed. What if she told the truth to Sai, or to their sensei? Well, the sensei knew and he hadn't acted any differently. Sai, however, he was usually so emotionless, would he care? Would that actually make him snap and turn bitter against him? Dickless, careful. He snorted. He highly doubted Sai would actually snap or do anything. The boy was mostly a robot. Warn me, when you insert the batteries they start charging. Remove the cable without checking and you might electrocute yourself. The raven-haired boy droned on. He was actually wondering if that was his concerned tone. He gave a side glance to Sai, before nodding to him and then gulping anxiously. All the broken cables had now been removed, and for safety measures also the damaged ones that would be checked and if possible repaired. Their sensei was watching from the doorway, keeping one hand on a metal bar that stood from the ground, probably to avoid statics. The batteries changed and the broken cables yanked. Naruto turned to where Sakura was piling the new cables, a fearful distance away from him. Sai on the other hand was moving to the commands of the relay station. Electricity in Konoha worked with batteries made with special elements that as genins they weren't privy of. There was some sort of secret mixture, highly flammable and acidic in nature, which easily corroded the copper used to laminate the batteries. The moment Naruto began to attach the cables, Sai, mistakenly at least in the blonde boy's opinion, flicked a button he wasn't meant to. Naruto gave out a loud howl of pain as he was literally forced to suffer through an electric discharge of many volts higher than the mere static jolt. He felt his skin burn on the point of contact and through his body, as it ran towards the ground using him as a discharger. Sakura stared in horror as electricity danced around the boy, passing through him repeatedly as it headed towards the ground. Sai was fast in turning off whatever button he had pressed, but the damage was already done. Naruto fell on the ground, his muscles twitching as his entire body was racked with spasms. Their sensei reached for the boy as fast as he could, hissing as he brought him outside. "I'll bring Naruto to the hospital." "Sakura, Sai, stop working and wait for my return." As the Jounin quickly left, leaving behind a worried Sakura and Sai, another figure hidden on a nearby building merely stood up and shunshined away, to warn its master of the plan entering the second stage. Sakura, remaining behind with Sai, felt torn. She had spent the morning watching over Naruto, trying to come up with anything really that could prove him the holder of the Kyuubi. The boy didn't look like a fox. He didn't look like a towering demon, and except for his insistence in eating his own ordered food, which had some justification to start with, there was nothing in him of inherently evil. If anything, the boy took the hard jobs without complaints. It could have been her in place of Naruto. She had fatigued in moving the batteries, since their size and weight was considerable, and he had offered to swap. She had accepted with a frightened look in her eyes, and because of that she just knew that she had given away her knowledge of his condition. The look on the boy's face had been of hurt, but he hadn't said a word afterwards. He had just taken on both the replacing of the cables and the placing of the batteries. He hadn't spoken a single word to her during his entire work, giving off fearful glances whenever she went off near their sensei or Sai, but never saying a word. It made her feel dirty. It was as if Naruto feared she would do something that would hurt him badly. "You know?" Sai suddenly asked from her side, making her turn her head quickly to where the boy was. "I know, what?" She hesitantly chuckled, trying to hide her nervousness and failing. "What is it that I should know, Sai?" "Dickless, you know." Sai pressed on. She felt a creeping chill settling on her bones, as the boy's eyes fixed on her with their usual lack of emotions. "You know of his status." "Sai? How do you know about it?" "Not relevant, Harano-san." Sai's retort came calm and composed, but the way he said her surname didn't make her feel any better. "Not relevant is how I know your parents' occupations and their time schedules. Not relevant is what happens if you tell. S-rank secret revelation has a death sentence, you know that, of course." "Sai, who are you?" she whispered in fear, as the boy merely shrugged. "I am Sai Sato. That is my name." "You're not really a genin, are you?" she said, taking a step backwards. She didn't fear Naruto now, she feared Sai. Whoever he was, he truly was scarier and creepier than Naruto. "Who I am is unimportant." The boy took a few steps closer to her, before whispering. "What you do, however, is." She was saved from answering by the return of their sensei. The man had been fast. She sighed in relief at his sight, clutching her hands to her chest. "Naruto will have to remain in the hospital for a few days," their sensei said, "it might even be a few weeks too. Sai, you should go and apologize to him tomorrow. I also want you to head to the library today, and get a good read of electrical systems. I will question you on what you did wrong tomorrow, so don't skive off." Sai nodded, making his eerie smile towards her, before running off. "Sensei," Sakura hesitated, as she gazed into her sensei's sunglasses. She hadn't been dismissed, but... "Sakura, I'm sorry to say this, but I need to ask you some questions concerning yesterday." She froze. What did her sensei want to know? Had they actually been watched when the civilian had practically revealed to her Naruto's condition? "Ayamuro Hiraga was found dead this morning. Eyewitnesses said that you were one of the last who saw the man alive. Is that true?" Sakura's stomach lurched and twisted as a wave of uneasiness settled on her. She grimaced as she nodded weakly. Sai wasn't lying. If she told their sensei about his menaces, she would probably lose her parents. Meanwhile, Naruto was twitching in bed, his hands loosely strapped to the side to avoid him hurting himself. He couldn't even talk, his mouth blocked so that he wouldn't chew his own tongue. The nurses and the doctors were commenting on how much of a rare case he was, of having awakened so soon after the electroshock. He tried to close his eyes, as tears streaked down his face. Today was truly a horrible day to be him. He didn't doubt he'd be fine within a week, but that would basically nullify his advantage on learning shurikenjutsu or kenjutsu from his teacher. In the time it would take for him to heal, maybe his teammates would already reach a higher level than him and he would be the one who would need to catch up. He was debating such things, when the man in the bed next to him turned his only eye to look at him. The man was old, and half his face was covered into bandages. A wooden cane stood in a corner, and he was probably the classical example of the lone old man. He had a plastic cup with 2 fingers of water within, and a set of pills on his bed desk. "Oh my," he spoke with a slightly worried face. "What happened to you?" He would have answered, if only his teeth weren't clattering against the wooden mouthpiece. The man slowly stood up with a huff, breathing raggedly as it grabbed his cane and walked over to his side. "Ah, I knew it. Saw a lot of this during my times in the war." The old man spoke to himself, as he flipped through his medical chart. "I suppose it's to be expected, but not even giving you a sedative." He frowned at that, shaking his head. "My, you must be suffering. Do you want me to try and make it better?" The pain that flared through his sore nerves was something out of hell. It was probably because of the pain that Naruto tried his desperate best to plead a yes with his head and his gaze. The man nodded and moved closer, and the boy saw how one of the elder's arms was in a sling. Had the old man gone through a blender or something, to become like that? "These are war wounds," the shinobi commented. "I suffered so many they retired me from active service after the war with Kyumigakuer." His working hand was gently placed on Naruto's chest and suddenly, the boy's spasms stilled. Naruto's eyes widened in surprise. How had the man done that? "Wind is strong against electricity," the old man replied, as he gently unclasped the mouthpiece that was holding Naruto's mouth close. "I sent my wind-laced chakra through your body, expelling the electricity within," he explained. "It is far more difficult than what I'm telling you, but it's as good of an explanation as it is for the moment." Then the old man coughed slightly, bringing his hand to cover his mouth. Quietly, he unclasped the closest of Naruto's bindings before returning to his bed. Naruto undid the other, and then wincing got up to sit on his bed. "Thanks," he whispered, looking at the man who merely smiled back. "I saw too many die in the war because of electrical jutsus. Too many were nothing more than genins, and far more died before anything could be done. Konoha never had many wind affinity shinobi, and the level of control required to expel electricity from one's body without damaging the brain or a body's nerves, that too is something rare." "Oh," the boy said, his gaze silently falling to stare at the old man's injuries. Even in those conditions, the man had still gone out of his way to help him. "Thank you again." "There's no need," the other man said with a small smile. "I admit I was selfish in helping you. I wanted someone to chat with while waiting for my nurse to come and order me around a bit," he whispered with a conspirator-like tone. "She's evil, let me tell you that." "Ah, I'm sure she just wants what is best for you," Naruto diplomatically replied, fiddling with his hands and fumbling his thumbs as he looked at the bedsheet. "Nah, sir, can I ask you a question?" "It is, may I ask you a question, and the answer is yes, you may," the old man replied calmly. "You know who I am, right?" he whispered, wincing. "You read my name and, well, you're old enough to." "Yes, I know what you are, and I know what you hold." The old man nodded gravely as he spoke. "This does not make me any less amiable in your regards, however. I know what a jinhuriki is, and I know that the yondaime would never make a shoddy seal to hold the Kyuubi at bay. So you don't hate me?" he asked meekly, looking with his blue eyes wide open at the old bandaged man. "No," the man replied. "You are a victim, just like everyone else is. Some people might be blind to the truth, but that doesn't make it any less real." The old man smiled then, and winked with his only eye. To judge a mass by the few individuals that stand out is wrong. What is important is that where there are people who are ignorant, there are also people who aren't. I never met them," he whispered. "You live in the one-room apartments for shinobis, right?" the man asked, before continuing. That's closer to the orphanage and the civilian sector. Not that there is actually a divider between the shinobi one and the civilian one, mind you, it's just a way of saying, but civilians don't usually pick on fuinjutsu. So they have no idea of what seals really are or how powerful they can be. So when they see you, they think that all that stands between the Kyuubi rampaging again and them is some ink drawn in strange patterns. Anyone would fear that. But the demon, he never spoke to me. Better that way then, right? The man replied. If he had, it would mean the seal was shoddy. This proves more than ever that it isn't going to fail anytime soon. Yeah. Naruto smiled hesitantly. You're right. Oh but, where are my manners? The old man suddenly said. I forgot to introduce myself, didn't I? My name is Danzo Shimura. I was a jounin of Konoha before the war took away the use of my arm and nearly deprived me of my legs. Ah, I'm Naruto, Uzumaki Naruto, Shimura-san. He actually replied earnestly. This was the most he had ever talked to someone since Toka's death, and he felt some sort of elation at being able to do so. Well, I'm a genin. I'm going to become a Chiryunin soon though, b. His voice trailed off abruptly, soon followed by a grimace on his face. I'll try my hardest. I'm sure you will. Danzo nodded with a small grin. Well, tell me, what team are you in and who is your sensei? With those words, Naruto found himself talking with the old man with a grin on his face. The man wasn't judging him, even though he knew what he was. For that alone, he'd talk to him. Meanwhile, in training ground number 3, Kakashi Hatake was looking with a half-narrowed eye at his own genins. The civilian girl, Ami, was a complete mess. The Inyazuka yelled out loud every time the Uchiha did something better than him, and since except for Taijutsu the dog user had little to offer, it meant that Kiba yelled most of the time. Sasuke on the other hand was scowling. He was scowling both because of the girl who seemed to do her best to stick at him or press herself against him, and also because the Inyazuka and his pet dog were starting to annoy him. Maybe he could poison the puppy, Akamaru. Kakashi coughed slightly, but since that didn't work to get his team's attention, he sighed and took out his Ika feral threesome and began to read out loud. Oh no, Tsum-chan, not now. I am sweaty after a long run. He mock-read, immediately earning the complete and utter silence of his 3 genin. Oh Zana-chan, not you too. You and your older sister that clearly doesn't look like your mother are so tightly pressed against my wonderful sweaty body that I feel I am about to. What the hell? Kiba yelled, seeing red. What the fuck is that smut? You said something. Kakashi remarked, peering from his book to gaze at the now open-mouthed Inyazuka. Are we going to train, Kakashi? Sasuke asked, scowling as he gave a look of disgust at the Inyazuka. Oh yes. He mumbled, returning to his book. Try and spar 2 against 1. Ami and Kiba, go against Sasuke. Then he flipped the page of his book, ignoring what his students were doing. He actually wondered why the Hokage had refused to give him the son of his sensei. He knew why he could not meet the boy earlier, being a Jinhiriki, he was basically a powerful instrument of Konoha from birth. The third Hokage had managed to make him live through a normal childhood, but in order to do that he had appeased the civilian population by keeping all shinobis away from Naruto's upbringing. That had lasted until the academy, but from that moment onwards. Yes, Kakashi had held cold feet from that moment forward. What was he meant to say? Listen kid, I knew your father, but I can't talk about it because there's a law in place. Oh, and by the way I'm an umbu, so I can't tell you anything of who lies behind my mask or what I do for a living most of the time. He rolled his eye as he flipped another page. He wasn't actually reading the book. He was just hoping someone would catch on that he was holding it upside down. He was sure Naruto would have caught on. Aoba had described him as a quiet and ingenious boy, just like the yondaime had been. So what if he had horrible grades? The boy should have been his to train. He was sure he would have caught on with the underneath thing. Not like this bunch of imbeciles. He was actually starting to feel sickened, and wondered why he hadn't failed them. Of course he knew the reason. For one thing, Kiba had actually no trouble working with Ami, since the girl's queen bee personality was in full force whenever she wanted something done by someone else, and the boy was so terribly weak to flirting that it made Kakashi wonder how he would fare against a kunoichi. Sasuke on the other hand. He was still unsure how the three of them had decided to work together. Probably because the time was running short, they had decided on a who gets the bell thing, and had attacked him all three at once. Of course he had tied Ami to the stump, and of course the girl had made wide sorry eyes at the Inyazuka for some food. And since Sasuke actually knew the Inyazuka was more useful with a full stomach than an empty one, he too had offered something to the girl. His words on team working disappeared from their brains after 5 minutes, 3 on the Inyazuka and probably 1.5 on Sasuke. He wondered if maybe, just maybe, he could fail his team afterwards. Denounce the girl for being a traitor of IWA and disappear into the forest was starting to become more and more endearing, especially when he realized the 2 against 1 had become a 1 against 1. Ami was now looking at his hair, again, and was probably going to ask him, again, where he had found the silver dye. Maybe he could pass off their deaths as training accidents? Maybe he could, he just had to play it smart. As Kakashi debated the murder of his students, Asuma and Kurane were having a mixed training day with their own genins. Of course the reason was just to enforce in-between team friendship, and clearly not because the two longed to be with one another. Asuma frowned slightly, before taking out a cigarette and lighting it. Shikamaru is sleeping, he mumbled. What a lazy brat. Should you wake him up? Kurane said, her crimson eyes looking with a slight layer of disgust at the lazy genin. How did you pass them to begin with? Tradition and politics, Asuma remarked. The same way you passed your team, I suspect. No, she sniffed haughtily. Had they failed, I would have failed them without concerns. Really? Asuma's right eyebrow rose. Ma. He took a puff of his cigarette, which hanged loose from his lips. What's with Hibachi then? He looks like a stick was stuck up his ass. Asuma. Kurane chided, looking affronted. He suffers from a superiority complex being smashed. He thought he was going to have it easy since his father is a shinobi, but then he ended up with 2 clan children. The woman's voice trailed off. He's having a hard time facing the truth. Asuma merely shrugged. If you say so. Then the man frowned hard at the sight of Ino defeating Hinata in a friendly taijutsu spar. Did a Hyuga just lose a taijutsu match? Kurane sighed, bringing her right hand to her hair. She shook her head slightly, before whispering. Hinata has some issues. Pretty bad ones, to lose to Ino of all people. Stop it. Kurane glared at Asuma. She just didn't want to hurt the girl. If you say so. Naruto was indeed dismissed by the hospital the same day he was admitted. It was late at night by the time he returned to his apartment, his stomach grumbling as he opened the door and stepped in. Heading towards the fridge, he opened it to find the usual desolation of sheer nothingness staring back at him. He groaned. If he wanted to eat something, he'd have to go out to one of those 24-hour shinobi-only shops. He had never been to one of them before, since they were a bit far from his house and reserved for fully fledged shinobis, which he now was. He was a bit nervous about trying it though. The civilian shopkeepers always glared at him hard whenever he reached for the counter. It wasn't as if they actually increased prices or anything, since they did have cash registers and all. The most pettiness he had received was during the last hours of a shop being open, being the last in queue and the man or woman at the register simply closing up before he could check his stuff out. Still, he did feel pretty good for having talked to a shinobi who didn't hate him or glare at him. Maybe he could try. Deciding that he would, he took a deep breath before heading out once more. In the middle of the night, Konoha was pretty much a ghost city. The few people who lingered around were either drunken guys or late shinobis, and both generally ignored whoever else was on the streets. Their only objective was to reach their own homes, so they simply ignored the slightly dark color-wearing boy with blonde hair that walked alongside the wall. Naruto looked ahead, his gaze softening as he saw a shinobi shop open with a sign claiming the 24 hours. Unknown to him, a masked shinobi that had been trailing him till then disappeared into thin air, his genjutsu required job done. The name of the shop was Root. He blinked as he came near the sliding doors, peering inside and then widening his eyes in surprise. He stepped in gingerly, as he saw sitting on a chair behind the counter the same old man of the hospital. "Shimura-san?" he asked in a soft tone, eyeing with slight shock the bandaged man. "Oh, Naruto," the old man said. "What a surprise. You took my advice to mingle more with the shinobis." Yes." He hastily nodded as his eyes traveled around the shop. It was a simple room with a set of shelves containing various dry foods, common utensils, and generally long-lasting stuff that went from detergents to odorless body soap. A few different sizes of neutral-colored clothes hung in a corner, while a small open-air fridge held the frozen stuff like pea bags or fried shrimps. "My, what a coincidence to see you again so soon." "Empty fridge," Danzo hazarded with a small grin. "Yeah. In between the missions and all I never have the time," Naruto admitted, walking closer to the counter. There were some chewing gums and shavers in a carton box near the register, as well as packets of cigarettes and more general everyday use stuff. "The woes of being a shinobi," the old man nodded. "Well, we have a heater in the back of the shop, for customers' usage. Sometimes you just don't have the time to go back home between one mission and another." "Thank you, Shimura-san," Naruto replied. He could actually eat without having to go back home and start cooking. That was a nice perspective. He headed over to the food shelves, biting his lower lip as he checked the prices in his own wallet. He had more than enough money thanks to his D-rank of the day before, and so he decided to treat himself to some powdered ramen. He paid the old man and then headed towards the door on the back of the shop. The door did lead into a smaller room, with a kitchenette in a corner and a table with 4 chairs in the middle. It also held a few lockers, probably for the shop workers to change, and a notice board filled with slips of paper. It mostly contained notices of shinobi asking for other shinobis to check on their apartments for a fee, and doing stuff like watering the plants and feeding their pets. That probably was for the jounins or chiryunins who were on long-term missions. If he ever needed extra money, he might just check on the notice board. He was heating the water for his powdered ramen, when a thought crossed his mind. He carefully peeked in back to the main room of the shop, and hesitantly asked, "Shimura-san, would you like a cup of tea?" "Oh? My, how thoughtful of you, Naruto. The tea is in the second cupboard from the left." The old man actually smiled and nodded, making Naruto grin as the blonde boy returned to his heating of the water. This was nice. A few moments later, and Shimura-san entered the room while leaving the door ajar, probably to check in case any customer came in. Naruto, simply put, was happy. For the first time, he wasn't going to be eating alone or in silence. At the same time, Danzo Shimura was calmly analyzing the jinhiriki. Sure, his face was smiling, grinning, talking, but he, the Yami of shinobis, was analyzing carefully every single detail of the boy's actions. From the choice of food to the way he had moved around. From the way he had prepared the tea and scooped the leaves to how he had then added the boiling water to his own cup of ramen. The way the boy's eyes traveled to the notice board and how they went to the lockers, everything was analyzed. He was a shinobi, he was meant to notice things. He always trained his root operatives to master their emotions, so that they could kill them on a moment's notice. His face smiled again as the boy thanked him again. Naruto had training to do, and he felt unfit to be in the team because he wasn't as smart or strong as his peers. Danzo merely nodded to the boy's words on training hard to catch up and finding something he excelled at. Children were incredibly resistant creatures. He knew that from all the orphans he had taken to root and had trained into flawless shinobis. They needed only a logical reason for something to happen, and they would follow through. To eat, a man would question why he had to do 500 push-ups. A child didn't. The child just considered it the norm that before eating, one had to do that number of push-ups. A child didn't question, he just accepted the words of the adult they viewed as a parental figure. That was why his operatives were ready to sacrifice themselves at a moment's notice for him. That was why he was sure his root operatives were all loyal to Konoha. He had trained them to be that, and they knew nothing else but that. Right now, he was using the same concept on the jinhiriki, and it was working. Had he been a smarter boy, he would have questioned the coincidence of meeting the same old man twice in the same day, or the fact that he was just so casually a wind affinity user who knew how to treat the excess of electricity in his body. If the boy had been smart, he would have queried on just what the chances would have been for something like this to happen, but the boy wasn't paranoid. The boy was desperate for acceptance. He was desperate for someone to look at him and say, with a kind smile, that he had done well. Sometimes, a single well-placed word could earn you far more loyalty than any amount of intimidation, treachery, or diplomacy. He smiled slightly as he saw the boy's head drop gently. Sleep was trying to claim the tired boy. Naruto excused himself then, waving goodbye with a face showing all the sadness a boy could muster at having to leave a place he liked. He waved back from his sitting position, and the moment the boy was gone he simply nodded to the hidden operative, who took his place at the counter. He casually opened one of the lockers, pressing the panel on the bottom with his cane. A click later and the lockers both swung aside, revealing the passage into the root headquarters. Sai was a useful operative, even if sometimes he showed all of his failure as a root member. The death of the civilian had been unwarranted, but the man had broken the law. Such strange displays of attachment were probably going to work against the boy, if the time came when the Jin hierarchy had to be put down. Well, if it came to that, then Sai would probably both kill the boy and become a heartless operative like he was meant to be, or he wouldn't and would thus die. Still, that didn't matter to him in the slightest. What bothered him was the painting the boy had finished and nailed to the wall of his own cell. That did bother him quite a bit. It was the painting of the photograph of his team, but of the three faces, only that of the girl was defined as smiling. Sai's and Naruto's were instead absent, as if the boy had yet to draw them in. It didn't worry him, but it did lead him to question just what Sai was trying to mean with that subtle action. Yet everything was proceeding according to plan, and Hiruzen would not be able to do anything about it, especially after he would gift Naruto with a valuable scroll. The one containing the only other Uzumaki name within the village, since the Sandaime had removed the name of Naruto's mother from the registers, to avoid the boy's undoubted questions. It was a little-known fact that Uzumaki Kushina and the Yondaime had been together. The few who knew had been killed during the Uchiha massacre or the Kyuubi rampage, and those who simply knew of the Uzumaki woman's pregnancy had been silenced during the passing of the years, by accidents. The only thing that remained was the scroll he held in the drawer of his desk. On it was the unchanged roster of all of the Konoha's shinobis, as well as Kushina Uzumaki's status of pregnancy that led her out of the ranks for the duration of it, a casual note on how the blood type of the girl's child and that of the Yondaime Hokage could fit with the type that Naruto possessed. And slightly more hints that would, undoubtedly, drive Naruto away from Hiruzen's camp, and firmly into his. Lies and deceits made the shinobi world what it was, but precisely because of that, truth was also a powerful weapon. Against truth, even Hiruzen would have a hard time to fight against. Check the description for the links to the author.